Chapter 16 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 16, in which I have but one voice. The festival was a success without either ring cake or grab bag, for the opposition to the latter had proved to be so marked that it, too, was discarded, though the curious silk bag was sold by ticket in a kind of genteel private way. During the whirl of preparation many of my accustomed duties had been neglected, among others my regular Thursday letter to mother. For 3 weeks I had not written a line to her, and I comforted myself with the thought that when this festival was over I should have plenty of time for that, and a great variety of other neglected matters. But no sooner had we calmed down from the excitement of our own festival, when we became eager over one that was to take place in a village a short distance from Newton. Mrs. Tyndall had a niece living there who was deeply interested in the affair, and Mrs. Tyndall's last brilliant idea was that a few of us should go out there and repeat for them our most successful tableaux. I entered into the scheme with great glee. Indeed, I had reached such a pitch of excitement that I seemed to have lost what little common sense I ever possessed. But some of the girls demurred. Lycia Simons, when appealed to, answered promptly and with some hauteur that she was not a professional performer and did not hire out by the night. At which Mrs. Tyndall composedly laughed, and remarked as we left the corner where our conference had been held, "Poor Lycia will never forgive Jerome for not inviting her into the Turkish tableau, nor me for not directing him to do so. She has been spiteful ever since." "Is that the trouble?" I asked, with wide open eyes, and she laughed as she answered, "Why, yes, you innocent mouse. You seem to have no idea that you are the envy of most of the young ladies in our set." Now I had not during all this time remained ignorant of the fact that Mr. Sayles was a general favorite. He was cultured and courteous, and had the air of a finished gentleman. He was reputed wealthy, both in reality and in prospect, being the expected heir of a wealthy uncle. Nor had I been at all unconscious of the fact, that while he might apparently have had but to choose his society from any family in town, his preference for me had become so marked and decided that it was a subject of general interest among our mutual acquaintances. I felt immensely flattered and grateful, and those very feelings led me into making some sad blunders. Well, concerning the festival, there were others who were of the same mind as Lycia Simons. Among them little Ruth Walker, though her mind was not expressed in the same manner, but simply and gently, that "mother would rather she did not go;" and Mrs. Tyndall's assurance that it should "not cost her a cent if that were the difficulty in the way," only had the effect of bringing a very becoming pink flush to her pretty face, and of giving perhaps a little more decided ring to her voice as she repeated her refusal. But there were others quite as eager for excitement as myself, who hailed the proposition with glee, and we made up a company of 7, and planned and rehearsed and frolicked away another week of time. In the meantime that unwritten letter to my mother lay heavy on my conscience; but my preparations had all to be made after working hours in the shop were over, and they left me very little chance even to think. One thing I carefully did, I avoided all tete-a-tetes with Dr. Douglass, though I could hardly have told why; at least I did not answer the question even to myself. It was the afternoon before the festival. I had been excused from the shop in order to finish my preparations. We were to take the 6 o'clock train, and expected to return on the 2 o'clock express. Dr. Douglass had hardly been present at table during the week. He was unusually pressed with professional cares. When he was present, there seemed to be a tacit understanding that our proposed trip was not to be discussed, at least the subject was not mentioned. As we arose from dinner on this particular day, the doctor turned suddenly to me. "Julia, can you give me 10 minutes of your time? I have a message for you." And without waiting for my reply, he at once led the way to the library, and closed the door after us. Then immediately he said, "Julia, are you going on that singular expedition tonight?" Dr. Douglass was not wise in his commencement. To address a girl of 16, especially one as devoid of sense as I seem at that time to have been, in a kind of horrified tone about something that she had fully made up her mind to do, is nearly certain to exasperate her. Accordingly, I was exasperated. "I expect to go to Westbrook this evening," I said haughtily. if that is the expedition to which you refer. He has told me since that he saw his mistake. His tone changed to one of gentle persuasion. Julia, I wish you would not. There are many reasons to urge against it. In the first place, the evening is fearfully cold and stormy, and you will get no rest tonight. And besides, have you thought how it will appear to absent yourself during a time of special interest, not only from all the meetings of the week, but from this regular Thursday meeting? You have, too, a young lady among your number who last week attended every meeting, and now at the last moment I hear has been persuaded into joining you. Who is it? I interrupted. Carrie Seward. Julia, I would not have had her mind led away at this time for anything. It is a very solemn thing to do. I didn't ask her to go, I interrupted impatiently. I didn't even know she was going, and your objections come at a singular time, a few hours before we are ready to start. How could we change our plans now if we wanted to, when we are expected and depended upon? You have known for a week that we are going. Why haven't you interfered before if you intended to at all? I did not know it, Julia, he said gravely. I knew that some wild scheme of the kind was projected, but I did not know that Mrs. Tyndall was engaged in it, nor that she had drawn you in. I certainly thought that she had more sense. Thank you, I said loftily. I drew myself into it, and I am not at all disturbed about it. Do you want me any more? Because I have a great deal to do between this and 6 o'clock. Yes, he said, beginning to walk the floor in the restless way that I remembered so well as a child. I want you to give up this scheme, Julia. I entreat it of you. It is a momentous time with us. There are solemn interests at stake. Had you been present at the meetings during this week, you would understand what a strange thing it will appear to have some of our members absent for such a purpose on such a night as this. Besides, there are other reasons. I am sure you have not stopped to think how your mother would look upon your public appearance in such a scene as that in which I saw you the other evening. I don't know what you mean, I said, coloring violently and speaking angrily. I mean, he said gravely, that I am sorry to have a friend of mine take for 5 seconds and in play the degrading and disgraceful position of a miserable heathen woman, a position which Christianity abolishes, and which women speak of when they are obliged to speak of it at all, with blushes of pain and shame. You are young and innocent, Julia, and the blame of bringing you in such a manner before the public rests upon older heads than yours. But for your sister Esther's sake, I would not have the like occur again. By this time my cheeks were blazing, and I must say, in extenuation of my own conduct, that I had a very vague idea of what he meant. I was both thoughtless and innocent, and had been led on by another, precisely as I have since seen young misses allowing themselves to be led, and I know just how they will feel about it at 20, provided they have not by that time decided not to feel or think at all. The doctor checked the indignant answer that rose to my lips. There is another point about which I must speak. This morning I received a letter from your mother. She is in a state of terrible anxiety about you. She writes me that she has not heard from you in 4 weeks, and feels certain that you must be ill. She has spent nights of torture, she says, on your account. I immediately telegraphed her that you are well. I thought we ought not to wait to write, for I value a mother too highly to keep her long in such suspense as was evidently hers. But since reading her letter I have been led to fear that I was not doing my duty in regard to you. You must let me ask you some very plain questions, Julia. Are you engaged to Mr. Sayles? At which question my cheeks, if possible, flamed hotter than before, and I answered with excitement. Such a question as that you have no right to ask. No one but my mother has any right to question me in that way. I don't feel certain of that, he answered gently. In this letter which I have received today, your mother begs me to remember that she trusts her child to my care, and that she expects me to watch over you as earnestly as I would if I were your brother in name as well as in heart. In view of all the apparent circumstances, if I were your brother I should ask you the question which I have just now asked you, and I feel that I must understand this matter before I can reply to your mother's letter. I wish my mother could remember that I am not a 10-year-old child, I said angrily. Well, since you demand an answer, I am not engaged to Mr. Sayles, and I haven't the slightest expectation of being. and you can telegraph that to my mother if you think best. Is that satisfactory?" "I don't know whether it is or not," he answered with grave sternness, "because I hardly see how I can justify such constant attentions as you have received and accepted from him on any other grounds." "You are not called upon to justify them," I said pertly; and as I think of it now, I am almost surprised that he did not box my ears in reply. "I cannot, in the first place, see how you can reconcile it with your conscience, or even with your pride, to receive his marked attentions when you think of Frank Hooper." Curiosity got the better of my pride just then, and I listened eagerly while he continued: "I don't think you can know quite how base his utter desertion of Frank was. They were to have been married in less than 2 months' time, when the great business crash came that involved Mr. Hooper and ruined his fortune, and then it took this Mr. Sayles but a few days to discover that he and Frank were not suited to each other." This story was entirely new to me. It made my cheeks glow again, but I answered with an incredulous smile: "I thought you were proof against gossip, Doctor. If this remarkable history is true, how do you account for the fact that Frank Hooper has twice at least appeared with him in public during the last 3 months?" "I can only account for it by the remembrance that she is a loving, forgiving, infatuated girl," he answered gravely. "I believe I had the history on too good authority to discredit it." "Nevertheless, I discredit it," I answered loftily. "And now, if you have nothing further, I really must go. I have a great deal to do before evening." I moved toward the door as I spoke, but he detained me eagerly. "Julia, let me beg you to think of this matter. I do earnestly hope that you will decide not to go." "I shall decide no such thing," I said angrily. "How absurdly you talk! How can I change it all now when I am pledged to go?" "Very easily. You can have no idea of the severity of the evening. I have heard it suggested several times that the festival would undoubtedly be postponed. Most of their people are from the country, and the country roads will be impassable. You know quite well that if your mother were here she would not permit you to go. But besides all this, if there are really souls at stake, ought you not to be in your place this evening, instead of working against the current?" I stood silent and thoughtful for a moment, then said quickly: "There is no use in talking about it any longer. People can't whirl their plans around as quickly as that. I can go to meeting every evening after this one for a month. There will be nothing in the world to hinder." Then I immediately left the room. Nevertheless, as I closed the door, I almost decided not to go. I was by no means in so reckless and unconcerned a mood as I had chosen to assume. I crossed the hall, revolving plans in my mind for satisfying Mrs. Tyndall with a change of program. "It would not be such an impossible thing to do," I said. "We are only in 2 tableaux after all, and the entire festival does not depend upon them. And if the evening is going to be so stormy, it will certainly justify us in not taking a ride of 3 miles after we leave the station." I was halfway upstairs when Mrs. Tyndall's silvery voice summoned me to the back parlor. She was sunken into the depths of her favorite crimson chair, with an exceedingly listless and inattentive expression on her face, and Dr. Mulford stood near her speaking earnestly. "My dear," she said as I entered, "you are in demand to day. The doctors seem to have you in their keeping. Dr. Mulford wishes to see you." He came toward me at once, holding out his hand and speaking rapidly. "My dear young lady, I have come to make a very earnest request that you would reconsider your plan for the evening, even at this late hour. I did not know of it until very recently. Mrs. Tyndall and yourself are the only professing Christians of the party, and you have some among your number, one in particular, who is treading on a very dangerous ground. She has simply entered into the scheme for the sake of trying to stifle her conscience. I beg that you will not help her in the effort. Besides, we need your help, your moral support. I am confident that there are many souls among us just trembling in the balance, and such a very little thing may turn the scale." "And what about our pledged word, Doctor, and the expectations that are based upon us? You seem to forget these things." He turned eagerly toward her. "I do not, madame. Under ordinary circumstances I should counsel you to be exceedingly careful in regard to breaking an engagement. But this is a special matter. It is the Lord's work. It behooves us to lay aside every possible weight, and be ready for his appearing. My brother Reynolds is pastor of that church, and if you will permit me I will myself explain matters to him. I know him well, and I assure you that he will understand and appreciate the reasons for the change." Mrs. Tyndall smiled quietly. "You gentlemen are the most singular creatures," she said quietly. "You think a word of kindly explanation is all that is necessary to justify one in almost anything. Now, I am not responsible to Reverend Mr. Reynolds, but to a committee of ladies, and I know them better than to disappoint them. My dear, would it not be well for you to commence your preparations? It is growing late. I think the doctor will excuse you." But I lingered for the issue. "I am sorry, doctor, that our going makes any difference. I do not quite understand these times of excitement, you know, and fail to be in sympathy with them. To me it seems so much better to live our religion all the time than to have these periodical and spasmodic fits of it, but then, of course, I have nothing to do with that. As for Carrie Seward, the child came to me last night in the wildest spirits. Your meeting seemed to have afforded her a great fund of amusement, and, by the way, I fear a number of those giddy creatures are deceiving you in the same manner. I should not have asked her to join us had I been aware of your objections, but as it is, you need have no fear. The giddy little thing will be safer with us than she will be frolicking in the prayer meeting." To all of which Dr. Mulford made no sort of reply. He even bowed his adieus without speaking, and immediately went away. "What an abrupt man he is," was Mrs. Tyndall's comment. End of chapter 16. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 17 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 17, in which I tread among the shadows. The ride from the station was severe enough to justify all that Dr. Douglass had said upon the subject. I thought I should perish. The hall was somewhat dingy, and only about half filled. A miserable foreboding of some coming gloom seemed to possess me. I tried in vain to shake it off. Mr. Sayles rallied me upon my low spirits, and Mrs. Tyndall laughingly assured him that 2 doctors had been too much for me. They had, indeed, succeeded in making me very uncomfortable. I watched Carrie Seward, who was fluttering about in a very unnatural state of excited glee, with a nervous fear of some calamity coming to her because of us, because of me, for I was the important element in our party that evening, and I could have broken it up. Why did I not? How many times after that evening I asked myself the same weary question. And the answer always was, that I yielded weakly, wickedly, as usual, to Mrs. Tyndall's stronger will. I, who prided myself, and always had done so, on my firm, strong will, when it came to the test had no will at all, but allowed myself to listen and be led whither she would. I have learned since, a fact that it takes many young people long to learn, that there is a marked difference between firmness and obstinacy. To add to my discomfiture, the evening had proved so forbidding that we had not been expected, and every individual to whom we were introduced expressed surprise at seeing us. I smiled drearily over Mr. Sayles' wonderment as to what all those people would probably have said if the evening had been clear and quiet, so that they could not have said, "I am surprised to see you here this stormy evening." Then I turned in response to his exclamation. But I do not think I was surprised to see Dr. Douglass standing in the doorway. It seemed to me to be an answer to everything for which I had been watching and waiting. I went toward him at once, and said in a tone of voice which I remember sounded strange even to me, "Have you come for me?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Your mother is not well, they have telegraphed. If you are very quick indeed, we may be able to reach the 10 o'clock train." It was like Dr. Douglass, that answer, brief, rapid, to the point, and giving me a strong motive for self-control and haste. I made no outcry of any sort, but went like one suddenly stricken dumb to the dressing room. It was Mrs. Tyndall's quick, deft fingers that robed me for the journey. She was tender and gentle, quiet and rapid in all her movements, but the face that impressed me, even then, was the white, frightened one of Carrie Seward, and the words that sank like lead into my heart seemed to drop almost unconsciously from her trembling lips. "We ought not to have come. I knew it, I knew it." Mrs. Tyndall's last thoughtful act was to wrap me in her fur-lined traveling cloak, and then I was ready. Dr. Douglass stood waiting beside the sleigh, and it was but the work of a second of time to seat me therein, and give the order, "Drive on." The horses dashed ahead, and the swift, silent drive commenced. The doctor tucked the robes about me, pushed a hot stone to my feet, keeping, meantime, a keen eye on the horses, and saying occasionally, "Go as fast as possible, we haven't a moment to lose." When we were within a quarter of a mile of the station, a long, shrill whistle sounded out of the keen air. "It's of no use, sir," the driver said, slackening his rein for the first time. "That's the whistle. You can't reach the train." "They will wait, I think. At least we will try. Dash ahead. You shall have $10 if we are in time." Then first I spoke, impelled by a sudden horrible fear. "Doctor, is she dead?" "No, oh no; but quite sick, and delays are such trying things at such a time. You shall be with her as soon as possible." And then we dashed around the curve, and drew up beside the train. The conductor stood on the platform, watch in hand. As he saw us the engine bell began to ring. "I thought we should have to leave you," he said, as we hurried up the steps. "4 minutes behind." "We are very grateful," answered the doctor. "There is no knowing how much those 4 minutes may be worth to us." Oh no, there was no knowing. I shivered to think of how much they might be worth. I grew every moment more frightened. The doctor must have reason to think her very, very sick, I reasoned, or every nerve would not have been so strained to reach this particular train, for I knew there was another at midnight. When we changed cars at Weymouth, I seemed suddenly to arouse to the fact that he was still with me, and had not stopped there to wait for a return train as I had supposed he would. "Are you going all the way?" I questioned, and he answered me simply and promptly, "Certainly." Another proof, then, that this illness was alarming, for I knew he was leaving patients who were very ill. Perhaps they had telegraphed him to come as counsel. "Did they send for you?" I asked eagerly. He shook his head. "No, at least not professionally, but I didn't wish you to go alone." "Doctor, let me see the telegram." "I haven't it. I left it in my room when I went there for some articles." "What did it say exactly?" "It said, 'Mother is very sick. Bring Julia.' Now you know all that I do, and we will hope for the best, and try to be calm and trustful. Can't I arrange those shawls and cloaks into pillows, and will you try to get a little rest?" I shook my head in horror at the thought, and I remembered just then one of his arguments against my attendance at the festival, "You will get no rest tonight." It was a night of gloom and foreboding, a long, long night, and when, occasionally, I caught a snatch of sleep, I awoke with hysteric sobbings from dreams of my mother's dying face. It was a clear, still, dazzling midday when we hurried through the streets of New Haven. The mocking sun was lighting the world in splendor, as if it were not a sad, weary, frightful world. I had pictured to myself many a time the pleasure of rolling through the streets of New Haven and stopping at Sadie's door, but I had never pictured it in this way. Oh, never! The sleigh stopped at last, and Dr. Douglass lifted me out. A strange face opened the door and addressed us hurriedly. "The lady is to come up quick." "Oh, where?" I asked wildly, and struggled to free my arm from Dr. Douglass's grasp, but he held me firmly, and spoke with gentle decision. "Be quiet, Julia. Remember how much may be depending on your self-control." Then we went up the stairs together into that pleasant south chamber that had been so accurately described to me as mother's room. I took in but one object distinctly. That was my mother's form. It was very unnaturally quiet, and the eyes were turned heavenward, and had in them a rapt, unearthly gaze. Dr. Van Anden held up his finger with a hushing gesture, but in almost the same moment said, "She has entered in," and turned pityingly toward me, but there came to me, then, one of those blessed moments of utter and entire unconsciousness. I remember only that when all knowledge of earth went from me, my head was lying where it had so often lain before, on my mother's breast. What a terrible awakening it was! How the dumb, awful sense of my loss and my desolation surged over me! Oh, mother, mother! I had neglected her. I had disobeyed her teachings, disregarded her injunctions, but I had loved her. How much I never knew, until I knelt there beside a mother from whom the soul had fled. I shall never forget it, that scene, nor the weary hours and days that followed, hours in which I was utterly and sometimes wildly rebellious. Only to have heard her voice once more, to have felt her kind eyes resting on me, to have been able to say to her, "Oh, dear, dear mother, forgive me," and then I thought I could have borne it. I remember how it seemed to me when I heard my brother say in low tones to Dr. Douglass, "If only you could have reached here on the morning express. I thought you would. I ascertained that my telegram went through. How came you to miss that train? She was conscious for more than an hour, and talked with each one of us. If Julia could have been here then." I think my voice must have sounded strangely to them. It had a hollow sound to me, and they both started when I spoke. "Dr. Douglass, is that morning express of which you spoke the one that leaves Newton at 8 o'clock?" The doctor understands my nature very well. He never evades the truth. So he simply bowed his head. "Did you get the telegram before 8?" Another silent bow. "Then, if I had stayed home that evening, I could have been here in time?" This time he bent over me and spoke in pitying tones. "Julia, my poor child, remember the compassionate Saviour knows all about it." But I answered him only by a low murmured, "Oh, how can I ever bear it?" And truly it seemed to me that I could not. Sadie was all tenderness and thoughtfulness. She talked to me a great deal of mother, dwelling particularly on the remembrance of how much mother had talked about me during the last weeks of her life, how great her anxiety was lest I was overworking, lest I was lonely and homesick and grieving for her. Sadie little knew what barbed arrows her words often were. To her these were only little tender memories of mother's constant brooding love for her child. To me they were proofs that I had racked her tired heart with unnecessary anxieties, and stung her with cruel neglect. During some of these talks Dr. Douglass was present, and he used to stand with averted face, if possible with his back to us, looking at a book or paper. Once, when Sadie was speaking of my mother's fears when no letter came, he turned suddenly and spoke almost sharply. "She received my telegram, did she not?" "Oh, yes," Sadie said, "and we were so thankful. She slept well that night. But the night before, she said that every time she slept she dreamed that Julia was in great peril, and awoke in a fright. We thought seriously of sending for Julia to come and make us a visit and relieve mother's mind. If we had not received your telegram just when we did, we should have sent for her." "Then, Dr. Douglass," I said, with a burst of uncontrollable tears, "I wish you had never sent it." He came and sat down by me, speaking gently and tenderly. "All things work together for good to them that love God." "I don't love him," I said, amid my passionate weeping. "I don't think I ever could have loved him, or I would never have gone on living as I have during this dreadful time. It is all a mistake. Everything is a dreadful, dreadful mistake." These times of violent grief were very rare with me. More generally I felt stunned, apathetic, indifferent to everything. I remember what loving care my brother Alfred had over me during those days. I remember principally his earnest, simple, fervent prayers when occasionally he led in family worship. I remember a certain dull sense of comfort I felt in thinking that Alfred was not like me, and Sadie was not like me, and that my mother was with those of her children who must have been a joy to her, and away from the one who would only have given her pain. It was the morning of the day on which we were to bury our dead that Sadie came to me in my room, and wrapping loving arms about me, said gently, "Dear Julia, you have said nothing in regard to our dress." "I do not care anything about dress," I said, almost fiercely. "I hate the word." She looked at me with a sort of pitying surprise. She did not know how persistently this question had robbed me of my peace during the past months, how at times it had seemed a very demon, whose aim was to appear before me whenever there came into my heart a shadow of longing after a different life from the one which I was leading. "Mother spoke of it," Sadie began again, in low tone, after a moment's puzzled pause. "She never approved of the custom of wearing mourning, you know. The feeling grew upon her, and she spoke particularly of her desire that we should make no change. Will that be unpleasant to you, dear?" "No," I said, apathetically. Nothing is unpleasant or pleasant to me any more. I don't care about anything." "Only heaven, and mother, father, and Ester, all there waiting for us," Sadie said, tenderly. But I think the strongest feeling in my mind at that time was a dull sense of satisfaction in the thought that I should go back to Newton and shock Mrs. Tyndall by not wearing mourning. During those days I had a kind of fierce feeling toward Mrs. Tyndall, as if she were the author of all my sorrow. It was a strange time, these 2 weeks that I spent with Sadie. Dr. Douglass went home the morning after the funeral, and left me to rest. I don't think I rested much. I gave entire freedom to the torpor that had come upon me. I did not try to rally from it in the least. My heart felt dead within me, and I let it remain thus, without an attempt or wish to rouse it into action. I told myself there was nothing to live for. Sadie had a husband and a home. I was not necessary to her comfort or happiness. Alfred was intent upon his business, his Sunday school, his little mission class. He had no need of me. And here was mother lying low under the sod upon which I was sitting, for I went much to my mother's grave, and during this time I do not think I once thought of her as glorified. Heaven seemed nowhere to me. There was nothing anywhere but a grave. As I look back on those days, I wonder that my brain endured the strain that I put upon it. I wonder most of all how those who have no personal acquaintance with a dying, risen Redeemer can ever live through the long, weary days that follow the making of a new grave, in which their all seems to be buried. I know now something of what it might have been to have lived so near to Jesus that I could have almost seen him open the gates of the holy city to let my mother in; that I could have almost heard the anthem of the angels as they sang her welcome home. There was no need that I should sit thus drearily upon a grave and look only on crumbling earth, when I knew that heaven and Christ and mother were all realities, and far above and away from graves; but yet it was not to me as if no Saviour of mine had ever lain therein. I was not conscious of feeling it, I was not conscious of a friend, I did not lean my head on his bosom as I might have done. I stood straight and tall and sullen, and yet I know now that all the while he led me by the hand, else I would surely have dropped away into despair. End of chapter 17. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 18 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 18, in which the blind led the blind. The day on which I journeyed back to Newton was one of those rainy, sleety, unutterably dreary days of late winter. I shuddered as I looked gloomily out on the black and dreary objects past which we whirled. Life seemed to me utterly purposeless and hopeless. I had not rallied from my sorrow, as girls of 16 are wont to do. I think there was too much regret and remorse mingled with my weeping to let my tears be easily stayed. I had steadily resisted Dr. Van Anden's earnest offers of a home and Sadie's pleading. I was going back to Newton. I had begun to earn my own living. I had meant some day to earn not only mine, but mother's. All that was past, but I was not in a mood to give up my work. Indeed, I needed it, to keep me from sinking in utter gloom. Those days of idleness and nights of bitter, unavailing weeping, spent alone in mother's room, well nigh drove me distracted. I think they all saw this at last, and yielded to my fierce wish to get to work. My employers had been very kind, as kindness goes. The senior partner, Mr. Sayles, had written me a letter full of well-meaning, set phrases. He had reminded me that sorrow was "the common lot of all," and that I must expect to be tried in the "furnace of affliction," that "in the midst of life we are in death," and that I had one more reminder that time was short, closing with the statement that 2 weeks were the utmost limit of their indulgence to me. They should like to do better, especially in this time of trial, but business cares were very pressing, and they needed all hands at their posts. I tore the letter into bits and burned it. Not that I considered it a bad letter in its way, not that I was ungrateful to them for their kindness in sparing me for 2 weeks. I knew they were busy, and needed me. But it cut me so to see the cold, hard fact set down in so many words, that mother was dead. Everybody knew it and realized it. I need expect no one to say to me, "Perhaps you are mistaken, perhaps she is not dead after all," or, "Perhaps you will hear from her tomorrow." Never such words any more. My mother was dead and buried. Everybody accepted the hard unyielding fact, and yet everybody went on about their work, and I must go about mine just as usual. The books must be kept, and everywhere things would be just as they had been, except that my Saturday evening letter would never come again. Oh, that awful exception! I shivered and drew my waterproof closer about me as I stepped from the cars at Newton. The air seemed thick and heavy, and yet was keen and pierced me through. I expected no one to meet me. I had not written to announce my arrival. It suited my mood best to go in sullen loneliness to my boarding place. But my feet had no sooner touched the ground than I felt my hand drawn through a firm, strong arm, and in a moment more I was seated in a close carriage. I silently gave my check when it was demanded, and leaned back in the carriage with a little touch of softened feeling over the fact that I had still a friend. "How did you know I was coming tonight?" I asked, as Dr. Douglass, having attended to my baggage, seated himself beside me. "Alfred telegraphed me this morning, according to my directions," he said quietly, as if it were a matter of course. Mrs. Tyndall's reception of me was the very perfection of kindness, tender, gentle, sympathetic, and yet not officious. But she jarred upon me. I felt in my heart bitter toward her. I blamed her for all my shortcomings and heart wanderings. More than all, I blamed her for that last evening of giddy pleasure. But for her, I said to myself, in what gloom and desolation only my own heart knew, but for her I should have seen my mother again. I should have heard her speak one more word, for I would not have gone that evening if she would have given up. And then there would come such a rush of hard, rebellious longings into my soul, and I would feel almost as if I hated her. Oh, those heavy days! I began to pray again regularly morning and evening, as I had been wont to do, for I did not openly rebel. But there was no comfort in my praying, no sense of nearness to my Savior. A great gloomy wall seemed built up between Christ and my weary heart, and I could not get to him. At least I thought I couldn't. In the shop I worked steadily and silently. The girls were kind, Frank Hooper spoke to me in softened tones, Caroline Brighton left me entirely out of her practical jokes, and little Ruth Walker kissed me softly and silently night and morning. And so I dragged my unwilling soul through the dreadful days, and sometimes it seemed to me that I should die. Sometimes I wished and longed for death. Often and often I fiercely longed for a sharp, protracted, prostrating illness, one that would bring delirium or unconsciousness to me. Many a time since then I have wondered at the goodness of my Father in not answering in all their bitter meaning my wild, unspoken prayers. It was not a natural condition of mind for one so young as I. It was not a simple, submissive sorrow, but my life for months had not been a healthy life, either spiritually or morally, and the reaction was marked and lasting. Dr. Douglass pushed to the door that separated the dining room from the library, and lingered beside me in the latter place one evening before the others came in. "Julia," he said gently, "will you not go out with me to the meeting this evening?" "No," I said, with a sudden rush of tears. I recalled vividly how I had said to him that I would go to church every evening after the festival, that there would be nothing in the world to hinder. And truly there was not. There need be no letters written to mother now. "I don't want to go," I continued. "I don't want to do anything, nor see anybody." "Will she like that, do you think?" he asked me in low, sad tones. I checked my tears in wonderment, and questioned, "Who?" "Your mother. Do you imagine that she has lost all interest in you because she has gone to another home, especially when she is looking forward to the time when you will come to be with her there? Do you think she is pleased with your utter abandonment of yourself to your sorrow, as if you had lost her forever?" There seemed a newness and strangeness in these ideas. "Will she like that, do you think?" he had said, not that dreadful, "Would she have liked it if?" That was always like the sharp-pointed needles pushed into me, but this "will she," not as though I had lost my mother, not that she had dropped out of life and left a blank. It flashed across me like a new idea. My mother is living. She does not live in New Haven now, she has moved, and the city to which she has moved is wonderful and beautiful, and she expects me to come and live with her. The sensation was new, and it thrilled me. She cared for me still. If she was living, she had not ceased to love me. I smiled at the thought. I looked up gratefully at Dr. Douglass. "I did not think of her as really living in heaven," I said. "Indeed, heaven seemed to me to be nowhere. It seemed to me that she must be in the grave. I saw her laid there, her very face," and the cloud swept over me again at the remembrance of that open grave, and I finished my sentence with choking tears. Dr. Douglass's next sentence hushed and awed me, and flushed my face with eager wonder and wild anxiety. "I have a message for you from her," he said quietly, and he drew from his pocket a small sealed package and gave it to me. "I don't know anything of the contents," he added. "The package was entrusted to me to give to you when I thought you could endure it. I think you need it now." I seized upon it in nervous haste, and hurried away with it to my room. The address was in Sadie's handwriting, and within, on a slip of paper that was folded carefully around the sheet, she had written a few lines. "My dear sister, only a few weeks ago I was talking with our mother about Esther's letter to me, read by me long after she was safe in heaven. I told mother about what an influence I thought it had exerted over my life since then, how much I prized it, and then I let her read it. I had never brought myself to do so before, but I thought mother would like to know about it. She seemed very much interested and deeply moved, and the next evening she entrusted the enclosed note to my keeping. 'You will see how it is addressed,' she said. 'If I should be called first you may give it to her.' Oh, Julia, I remember with what a great throb of pain I took it from her, hoping and praying in my selfish heart that some other hand than mine might give it to you, that when mother went away I might be there in heaven to welcome her, not that I wanted to leave my husband and my home, but I wanted to cling to mother. It was but a few days afterward that God called her. And now, my darling, I send this letter to you. I hope it will not make your pain deeper. I trust that it will come to be a help and a comfort to you." Then I took up with reverent hand the enclosed sheet, and read in that dear handwriting that was so familiar to me those loving words, "To be given to my dear daughter Julia when her mother is at rest." That sentence brought a burst of tears, and it was some little time before I was quiet enough to open the letter and read. "My precious child," so it commenced when at last my tear-dimmed eyes could decipher the words, "Mother isn't going to make you sad over this letter. I do not want you to be that. I write it rather that it may come to you in your sorrow and help you to be strong and brave. When you read it, darling, think of where I am, in heaven, your father and Esther and I, waiting there for the rest of the children. It is not to be a long letter, it is only to say God bless you and keep you near to Him. Remember, my child, that mother's great longing, her absorbing desire for you, is that you shall keep close to Jesus. The older I grow and the nearer I come to the end, the more I realize that for us who are His children there should be one absorbing prayer, 'Nearer, my God, to Thee, nearer to Thee, even though it be a cross that raiseth me.' Now, my darling child, good-bye. I give you a mother's blessing to follow you all your life. May it be a long, good life, such an one as we, waiting for you up there, will love to look at. I hope it will be a cheerful life, that great trial or pain may not be necessary for you. But remember, above all other things, I hope and pray that it may be a life of single-hearted consecration to Christ. My darling, good-bye. God bless you and keep you, Mother." I sat still, very still, and held this sacred letter in my hands. My tears were dried. I did not feel like shedding any more. I felt awed and solemnized. It almost seemed to me that I had heard a voice speaking to me from heaven. I had never hoped for another letter from my mother. I had mourned, oh, so bitterly, that she could not have said to me good-bye. Now here it was, the good-bye, the blessing, the earnest parting words. There was no hint as to what my life had been of late. I was thankful that my mother had been spared the grief of knowing. "E'en though it be a cross that raiseth me." I had not prayed that prayer, but perhaps mother had for me. The cross had fallen upon me bitter, and heavy to be borne. Would it raise me to Him? "It shall," I said, aloud and solemnly. "I will live a different life. O mother, your prayer shall be answered. I will hide my life in Christ." I prayed that night, prayed long and earnestly, but there was no rest in the prayer, no comfort, no light. The words as I spoke them seemed to sound dully back against my own heart. Still, I was in a measure satisfied. I felt that my cold-heartedness was the reaction from incessant grief. I made many resolutions. I would begin to live now in earnest. I told myself I would be strong and brave, as mother had wished. I would make myself what I knew would please her. There was work for me to do in every direction. I would not shrink from or shirk it any more. As I look back tonight on the resolves and the prayers of that evening, I both smile and sigh, smile at my ignorance, and sigh that it was possible to have been so ignorant. I who had been a Christian for more than 6 years. How wonderful it is that Christ submits to our being named after him while we are living such miserable, dwarfed, sickly lives. I seemed to imagine that I had but to signify my willingness to retrace my steps and take up my dropped and neglected duties lying about me on every side, when at once the full blaze of light and love and peace would burst upon me. I went to work at once among the girls in the shop, and I worked very much as I prayed, with many laborious, earnest-sounding words, that seemed to sound hollow and bound back at me from every point. "Frank," I said, in earnest and disapproving tones, when we were alone in the storeroom for a few minutes, "why don't you attend the meetings? I should think you might show so much interest at least." Frank bestowed a searching look on me, and then answered solemnly, "Because I am a reprobate. There is no mistaking that fact. I really don't believe there is any hope for me. Suppose you try Carrie Brighton. I shouldn't wonder if you'd find her in a softened state of mind. I'm a sad instance of total depravity. There have to be some standing proofs to a doctrine, living witnesses, you know, and I'm one of them." "I wouldn't trifle about anything so solemn," I said severely. "Solemn as what? Total depravity? It is a solemn truth. I'm convinced of that. I don't trifle with it. It trifles with me, lies in wait to deceive me at every point." She whisked off at the conclusion of this sentence, and left me wondering whether indeed her gaily spoken words were not true, and herself a hopeless reprobate; and not a shadow of doubt as to whether I had spoken the right words to her in the right manner for one moment entered my mind. I made one more effort during that day. I asked Caroline Brighton if she didn't think it would be a good idea for her to go to the meeting that evening. She answered me with grave thoughtfulness: "I don't know. What time do they close? What time was it last night and the night before?" "I don't know," I answered confusedly. "I wasn't there." "Oh! Well, if I thought it would be out by 8 I might go, but you see I am going to the circus at 8, and if they shouldn't close in time it might be awkward." There was a chorus of laughter from the girls who had heard her loud replies, and guessed at my low-spoken questions. "How religious that girl is getting," I overheard one of the girls say as I passed out of sight but not out of sound, and Caroline answered: "It isn't religion, poor child, but she thinks it is. Her mother is dead and she feels dismal, and has mistaken the symptoms. I feel as patient as Job toward her." And this is all my profession of religion was worth in that shop! Yet I was in earnest. I honestly grieved over my failures, only there was this one difficulty, I never imagined them to be my failures. I was being led by my own blind self, and mistaking it for the leadings of the Spirit of God. End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 19 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 19. In which are conflicting forces. One of the marked features of my changed feelings during those days was my aversion for Mrs. Tyndall. It grew upon me, which was no wonder, for I nursed it as a virtuous thing. I would not tolerate the slightest interference from her; indeed, I named her most innocent and kindly words after that title. I really wonder at her patience with my lofty airs, and often sharp words. I remember how vexed I was to discover that Dr. Douglass by no means approved of this marked change. "I don't understand you in the least," I said to him one evening, speaking irritably. "There seems to be no such thing as pleasing you. When I was allowing Mrs. Tyndall to lead me in any direction that she chose, you were always looking grave and disturbed over it. And now that I am trying to break away from her influence, and be myself, you seem equally out of sorts about it." "No, Julia," he answered gravely, "I am not sorry that you do not yield to her influence as you formerly did. I am only sorry for the manner in which you exhibit the change. You seem almost bitter in your feeling toward Mrs. Tyndall, and unjust in your estimate of her." "I am bitter," I said fiercely. "I wonder if I haven't reason? Think what a life she has made me lead. She has interfered with everything that was ever taught me. She has warped my judgment and biased my opinions; and, worse than all, made me neglect my own mother. I can never forgive her for it." "But, Julia," he interposed, with a puzzled and troubled air, "was it absolutely necessary to follow in her footsteps? Had you really no other guide, no other friend?" "It makes no difference whether I had or not," I answered moodily. "I followed her at any rate." "But I think it makes great difference; and herein lies your mistake. You are blaming Mrs. Tyndall instead of your own heart. You are indulging in bitter, unchristian feelings toward her, instead of going to the fountainhead of all the trouble, and laying bare your own heart." "She has been a professor of religion for a good many years. She ought to have set me a better example." "Suppose she had done so, is there any certainty you would have followed it? Was there no other example than hers to follow?" "Oh, yes," I said angrily. "I might have followed yours. I suppose that is what you mean." To this I received no answer, other than a reproachful look from grave, sad eyes. Then he asked me in gentle, tender tones: "Do you find rest and peace in your religion nowadays, Julia? Do you find comfort in prayer?" "No, I do not," I answered, with quivering lip. "I try to pray, and it seems to me that I can't. I am not at rest at all. I don't know anything about peace. My heart is all wrong, and I can't get it right." I finished the sentence with a sob. My heart was very sore. All my efforts at reform, either in myself or others, seemed to end in failure, and sometimes I was half angry, and sometimes my heart felt as if it were broken. The doctor answered me gently: "No, poor child, you can't. If I were you, I would not try any longer. It would do no good if you were to keep trying for 100 years." I turned to him, great astonishment in my voice. "Doctor, what do you mean?" "Why, my dear child, don't you see you have reached the very center of all the trouble? Your heart is all wrong, and you can't make it right. Why should you try? Why not take it to Jesus, and tell him, 'Here, Lord, is my heart, it is all wrong. I can't do anything with it. Create in me a clean heart, and renew a right spirit within me.'" My tone and manner of speech had changed very much during the last few sentences that I had spoken. One of those sudden moods to which I was subject during those days had swept over me, and my heart seemed melted. I think I was honestly trying to get into the light, and stumbling over my own blind self. I had a letter that evening which had much to do with all the after years of my life. Dr. Douglass sent it up to me when he stopped on his way to prayer meeting; sent that, and a renewed request that I would go out with him to the meeting. But I shrank from that. I distrusted my own nerves, and dreaded above all things a show of feeling that would draw me into notice. His request irritated me, perhaps because my conscience desired to avoid the matter, and I gave a very decided refusal, and sat down with ruffled feelings to my letter, indifferent as to who had written it, since the penmanship was neither Sadie's nor Alfred's. It ran thus: "Dear Cousin Julia, Mama and Papa are going West, for Papa's health. Brother Ralph and his wife are in Europe, you know, and I am still to be disposed of. The question is, whither shall I go? I want to come to you, share your room and your bed and your heart. May I come? Coax your hostess for me. We ought to love each other more, you and I, because of our dear Esther. That is, you ought to love me very much more than you do. I love you enough already. How our friends are gathering home! I want to see you and talk with you about them. How glad Esther must have been to welcome Auntie. I wonder if she is acquainted with Mr. Foster now. I have only one treasure, my very own, you know, waiting for me; while you, why, you are rich. Uncle and Auntie and 2 sisters and the little Minnie. Isn't it nice to think you will have to leave none of them down here when you go home? I like that thought. I was sorry not to be with you when you laid Auntie's body to rest, that is, somewhat sorry, not so very sorry, you know, because I remember her face as it was when I saw her last, and you know she will look ever so much more like that when I see her again than she will like the coffined face that, in spite of yourself, comes in between you and your mother in heaven. I know how that is. The veil of the flesh is sometimes heavy, but it lifts, and, my darling, there is glory behind it. I want to come to you. I think very likely we need each other. I want to come just as soon as I can. I want you to run down now, this minute, just as soon as you finish your letter, and coax your Mrs. I've forgotten her name, to take me to board. Tell her you want me, you know. You do, don't you? Write to me this evening when you have come back to your room, then I shall have your letter on Thursday, and if it is such a letter as I think you will write, such a letter as I want you to write, why, then you will have me on the following Tuesday. Your loving Cousin Abbie. It was certainly a very strange letter of condolence. Indeed, you see, there was no pity or sympathy expressed, or apparently felt. Yet it touched me as none of the good, kind, well-meaning, terrible letters that I had received since my mother's death had begun to do. Yes, I certainly wanted her. I had not realized it before. I had not thought of her at all, but that letter made me feel as though she were just the thing for which I had been longing and craving. I went down with the letter in my hand to Mrs. Tyndall. She was lounging on the sofa in the library, and her husband was lounging in an easy-chair beside her. They were laughing when I came in, but they checked their mirth as if they must not laugh in my presence. I did not need these constant reminders that my mother was dead. I told my errand briefly and somewhat stiffly, not at all in the coaxing way that Abbie had probably imagined. Mrs. Tyndall laughingly addressed her husband. I declare, Mr. Tyndall, I believe we shall have to open a boarding-house in self-defense. This is the 3rd application that I have had lately. Julia, I would do almost anything for you, and I feel peculiarly anxious to help you now in your sorrow. But it does not seem quite the thing for me to go to taking boarders. You know I hardly consider Dr. Douglas and yourself in that light. Who is this cousin of yours? I had a weapon to make use of that I considered more effective than any coaxings of mine. I briefly produced it now. She is the only daughter of Mr. Ralph Ried of New York City. Mrs. Tyndall's eyes brightened. She sat up with sudden energy. Not Ralph Ried of the firm of Ried, Wilkinson and Company? Yes, ma'am, that is Uncle Ralph's business address. Why, how very singular! Mr. Tyndall has had business dealings with him for years, and I saw him myself once. He is an immensely rich man, even as New York people count riches. And this young lady is his daughter? Why have you never told me before? I do not remember that you ever asked me, I said with exceeding stiffness. Whereat she laughed pleasantly and continued her catechism. What is this young lady like? What have I heard about her? Mr. Tyndall, don't you remember the Arlingtons told us of her? She was disappointed matrimonially or something of that sort, wasn't she? Her intended husband was killed but a few hours before their marriage was to have taken place, I explained. Oh, yes, I remember. How very sad. Does she wear a widow's dress? No. Well, it wouldn't be wise. Might interfere with future marriages. Well, Julia, under the peculiar circumstances, I might let her come for a while. I suppose there is really no reason why I shouldn't, only it is rather funny. I had had not a shadow of doubt as to my success from the moment that she had exclaimed, "Not Ralph Ried of the firm of Ried, Wilkinson and Company." So I went away without exhibiting much elation over my success, and wrote my letter to Abbie. Then I waited for her with some impatience and a great deal of curiosity. I had not seen her since my sister Esther's death 6 years before. I remembered her very vividly as she was then, but now I reflected she was 24 years old. It seemed an age fraught with dignity. I more than half expected to be afraid of her. I made great preparations for meeting her at the depot, enlisting Dr. Douglas into the service, who most unqualifiedly approved of the expected arrival. But she came unexpectedly after all. My cousin Abbie always did and always will do unexpected things. I came home from the shop a little earlier than usual on the day in which we were looking for her, and hastened at once to my room, eager to have it properly garnished in her honor. The moment I opened the door, 2 small soft hands were placed over my eyes, and I was kissed, mouth and nose and chin, little gleeful laughs issuing meanwhile from the sweet lips of the kisser. At last she released me, and stood back for a more "artistic view," so she said. "Yes, you look like her, you certainly do," she said at last, in a bright, eager voice. "I was afraid you wouldn't, but you do very much." "Look like whom?" I said at last, wonderingly. "Ester. You see, I wanted you to resemble her, because it would seem so natural. She and I spent so many happy hours together, and now you and I are going to." This seemed strange to me. I had rarely heard my sister Ester mentioned during those years, and when she had been, it was in a solemn tone, as one who was dead, gone out of our life, away from our interests, to be spoken of no more. I remember I thought then that Abbie spoke of her more as we would of one who had gone to Europe to live than as one who had died. When we went down to tea, I smiled to think of Mrs. Tyndall's conception of her in widow's weeds, she looked so bright and fresh, her fair hair still clung in rings about her head, and her dress, of soft clinging material, was as blue as the sky, and fitted to her fairy-like form to perfection. She looked and seemed not a day older than I remembered her as a child. Her reception of Mrs. Tyndall's graceful courtesies was sweet and sunny. I frowned upon them, and inwardly resolved that she should not be deceived as I had been. "I will tell her all about that woman to night," I said to myself in an emphatic manner. Mr. Sayles was present, and Abbie chatted with him in the free, frank way that it was her nature to assume. While we loitered at the table, the church bells rang. "Do you have meeting this evening?" Abbie asked of me with brightening eyes. "Is it your church bell? Why, wouldn't that be a pleasant omen to attend a prayer meeting on the first evening of my arrival?" Dr. Douglass explained that they were holding a series of meetings, in which subject she at once became deeply interested. "Isn't it time to go?" she questioned as we still lingered. "Oh, no, I am not in the least tired. I rested nicely last night. I always do on the cars. I shall like to go very much." "The little enthusiast," Mr. Sayles said, laughing. They were talking about her still when I went back to search for my handkerchief, and as I opened the door, I heard him say that, in an amused tone, "The little enthusiast! It is really refreshing to hear her talk." Then to me, "Miss Julia, I have promised to conduct your little cousin and yourself to church this evening, if you will allow. Dr. Douglass was obliged to go out professionally, and deputize me." Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "You must tell a straighter story than that," she said gaily, "if you want Julia to believe you. Julia, he offered his services to take you to church, and the doctor looked amazed, as well he might. I think the millennium must be coming." "Or the days of witchcraft returning," Mr. Tyndall said, amusedly. End of Chapter 19. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 20 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 20, in which are some searching questions. The meeting was one of marked interest. I felt thrilled and solemnized, felt also a great longing after that rest and peace and joy of which several spoke with great earnestness. I think this was one among the many mistakes of my life at that time. I went about searching for the rest and peace and joy, never realizing that to one who was faithfully and patiently lifting her cross, they came without being looked after. "Was it not a precious meeting?" Abbie said, as we walked homeward. "Didn't you enjoy it?" She asked the question, not of me, but of Mr. Sayles. He answered in a very amused tone. "I really cannot say that I did, particularly." "Oh, didn't you? I am so sorry. What was the trouble?" "The trouble was with me, I suspect. Miserable sinner that I am. I failed to get into the spirit of the affair." Abbie raised her eyes to his face, and gave him a surprised, sad look. In the glow of the moonlight, her face seemed to me that of an angel. "Do you mean that you are not a Christian?" she asked, after a moment's silence, in low tones. He seemed excessively amused. It was with difficulty that he restrained an absolute laugh. I felt greatly provoked with him, and a little bit so with Abbie. It seemed to me a decided case of casting pearls before swine. "It must be the first time that anyone ever imagined for a moment that you had a serious thought on that subject, or any other," I said, tartly. "I don't wonder that you are amused." He laughed with his usual careless good nature, made some light remark about the meeting not having improved my manner of speech, then bent his head toward Abbie, and said gently, "You seem surprised." "I am," she answered, still sadly. "I surely thought that you were a Christian." "May I ask why?" "Oh, I hardly know. You seemed such friends, all of you, Mrs. Tyndall and the doctor and all. I thought of course that bond united you." He was grave enough now. "I wish it did," he said, earnestly, and then we were at home, and he left me wondering whether he really wished any such thing. It seemed very unlike him, and yet it was the first grave sentence that I had ever heard from his lips on the subject. Abbie went directly to Mrs. Tyndall's side, nestled indeed on the low ottoman in front of her, and said, "You should have gone tonight. It was a precious meeting. Are you not able to go out in the evenings? What a deprivation it must be to you." With a person sitting opposite to her, who knew that she had been out to a concert, or lecture, or shopping, 4 evenings in succession, it would hardly do to leave this supposition unexplained; so she answered frankly, "Oh yes, I am able. But the fact is, my dear child, I am older than you, and of course haven't your delightful enthusiasm." Such a commencement as that had puzzled me once, and it irritated me nowadays. I had been wont to answer it with wondering silence, until of late I was given to turning from her with a disgusted frown. Abbie asked, simply and sweetly, "What has enthusiasm to do with going to prayer meeting, Mrs. Tyndall?" "A great deal, my dear. Indeed, I fear that in the minds of many people there is nothing left of the meeting but enthusiasm. The fact is, my dear, I do not believe in religious spasms. I think them very unhealthful. How did you like our church? Don't you think the colors light up well?" "Very well. I thought the church exceedingly pretty. What are religious spasms, Mrs. Tyndall?" Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "Why, going to meeting every evening," she said at last. "A season of excitement that leaves no one better, but rather worse." "But, Mrs. Tyndall, what is excitement?" My cousin Abbie had a most remarkable talent for asking direct, close questions, and keeping persons to the point, looking at them, meantime, with great earnest, thoughtful eyes. Mrs. Tyndall nestled uneasily among the cushions. "Why, making an unnecessary commotion about a matter." "Well, but you are talking about something that is not taking place. If commotion means noise, there was none of that this evening. It was very quiet and solemn." Mrs. Tyndall laid her hand on my cousin's arm, and spoke with winning sweetness, but in a tone calculated to check all further discussion. "My dear, I don't quarrel with other people's fancies in the least. They may go to prayer meeting every night in the 365, if they are so disposed. But, personally, I don't like religious fanaticism. Julia, was Mr. Sayles out tonight?" "Yes, ma'am," I answered briefly, and Abbie asked, in her most gentle tone, "Mrs. Tyndall, won't you please tell me what religious fanaticism is?" I think it at last became evident to Mrs. Tyndall's mind that she must give a direct and definite answer to Abbie's questionings, or else definitely decline to do so. "I think," she said, speaking slowly and with dignity, "I think that the getting up of special meetings at a certain season of the year, and insisting that at that particular time people must desert their other employments and duties, and go to church all the time, is fanaticism. I want my religion to be an everyday affair, and not something to put on during a few weeks in the winter." "But, Mrs. Tyndall, do you reason in that way about other matters? Don't we take advantage of the season of comparative leisure to get up lectures, and concerts, and benevolent associations? Why should we not use the same wisdom in trying to reach the religious nature of people?" "Excitement isn't religion," Mrs. Tyndall said, with that delicious disregard for logic that people of that temperament are apt to exhibit. Abbie replied with great calmness, "No, certainly it isn't, and excitement isn't music either, and yet I never heard people object to a reasonable amount of enthusiasm over some exquisite rendering of a beautiful song, for instance. Don't you think that we are a little bit too much afraid of a religious excitement, when we consider excitements over common matters perfectly correct and reasonable? What do you think excitement is, anyway, Mrs. Tyndall?" Mrs. Tyndall laughed pleasantly. "How like a moving dictionary you treat me," she said gaily. "Why, I think excitement is excitement, don't you?" And Abbie laid her hand on the lady's arm with a winning, caressing movement, and said, gently: "No, but seriously, please." "Well, of course I mean by excitement extreme interest in any matter, interest carried to an improper degree." "And what degree of interest do you think is proper in regard to religious matters? When does it become extreme?" The answer was a very cautious one. "Of course there can not be too great a degree of interest, but there can be an injudicious expression of it." "And do you think prayer meetings injudicious?" "Why, no, of course not. But—" And then there really seemed to be nothing further to say. Abbie waited a little, and then spoke in a very earnest tone: "Don't you think we sometimes amaze our unconverted friends by no expression at all of, or interest in, religion, or in them spiritually? How strange it would seem if your husband lay dying in the room above, and you sat here chatting with us, and suppressing all unseemly interest in him." "The cases are not analogous," Mrs. Tyndall said quickly. "If he lay dying, the danger would be immediate and certain." "How can we ever be sure how near and how certain it is in regard to the never dying souls?" Abbie's voice was very low and tender, but so solemnly in earnest, and for the first time since I had known her, Mrs. Tyndall responded only by silence. The door was no sooner closed upon us in our room than I commenced at once: "I am glad you have learned something already of Mrs. Tyndall's peculiar views. She has had a great many of them. I have been dreadfully deceived and misled by her. I am sure I didn't want you to be. How did she impress you?" "As a woman for whom we ought to pray," Abbie answered, so gently and earnestly that for a moment my volubility was checked. I rallied, however. "You may well think so. If you knew as much about her as I do!" And immediately I launched forth into the history of my acquaintance with her, from the time of my coming to her house to board up to that date. She received the history in absolute silence, and at last, to break it, I had to assail her with a question: "Did you ever hear of such a woman in your life?" Her answer was very gentle: "Dear Julia, I presume the Savior has. He bears with all classes of Christians." "I don't believe she's a Christian at all," I said stoutly. "I think she is a hypocrite, if there ever was one." I am always so very thankful that we not only have not to judge of people's conduct, but are absolutely forbidden to do so. Dear Julia, I think it is harder to pray for any one toward whom we harbor such thoughts. Don't you?" "She doesn't think she has any need for anybody's prayers. She thinks she is perfection." "Do you pray for her, Julia?" No. I frankly admitted that I had never prayed for her in my life. "I can't," I added bitterly. "I know I don't feel right toward her, and I can not. Oh, Abbie, if you only knew what I have to thank her for." Whereupon I told her, with many bitter tears, that sad story of the festival, to which I would never have gone but for her, and how I thereby lost that last kiss from my mother, for which my heart would always ache. I told the story truthfully, I thought. I know now that it was strangely colored by my bitter feelings. Indeed, Abbie's first sentence showed it to me in part. "Poor child, poor darling child! And you could not decide which was right, whether to go or stay? Did no one advise with you? Did you pray about it very earnestly, Julia?" I was silent and dumbfounded. No one to advise with me! What if she had heard Dr. Douglas's pleading and Dr. Mulford's earnest words? I distinctly remember that I had not at any time felt the least doubt as to which was the strictly right thing to do. "No," I said at last, speaking more humbly than I had before. "No, I didn't pray about it at all." "How could you have expected to do right?" she asked me, softening the words with a loving caress and tender kisses. "Do you pray about every little thing?" I questioned abruptly, and she answered me with brightening eyes and smiling lips, as if there was a wellspring of joy in the words: "For the very hairs of your head are all numbered." She changed the subject after that suddenly and brightly. "This does so remind me of Esther's and my first evening together, only we were wicked that night, very wicked. I was at least. I talked to her until after 1 o'clock. But, you see, I had so many things to ask her about, Aunt Laura and all of you." "You will have no mother to ask me about," I answered, mournfully, with the ever ready rush of tears. She turned toward me with wondering eyes, and spoke wonderingly. "Why not? Don't you like to talk about your mother? You have had no one, though, to talk with. But you will like to tell me all about her, will you not? Because, you know, I love her too. Oh, I have looked forward to nice talks with you about Aunt Laura." Again as I listened to her, there stole over me that strange, sweet feeling that, after all, mother was my mother still, even though God had given her a better home. Abbie said, "I love her too," not "I loved her," as so many say. Then I need not cease to love my mother. I brought my chair and nestled beside her. "You talk differently from other people," I said frankly. "Everybody else acts as though mother was utterly gone out of existence, and when they speak of her, they speak of one who has lived, but doesn't any more." "I know," she said gently. "We all talk like unbelievers in one of the most blessed truths of our religion. But that doesn't make it any less certain that our Christian friends who have gone from us are surely living and loving, and waiting for us in heaven." "Does it always seem real to you?" I asked wistfully. "I would give anything to realize it, as you seem to. Sometimes it seems to me that mother is in the grave, and that heaven is a misty dream. Do you never feel that way?" She answered me with a bright smile, and an emphatic shake of her head. "No, my heaven seems very near and dear. It is to me as if my friends who are living there had told me good bye, and gone away to Europe to live, and were expecting me to come out there to them in a little while." "But the letters," I said, hesitatingly, half feeling as though I ought not to speak of so material a thing in connection with the dead. "If they were in Europe, we should be watching for their letters, and expecting them by every steamer. But now it is such a long, long silence. If we could only hear from them." She answered me in that bright voice of hers which had such a wonderful ring of joy in it. "And the anxieties and fears lest they may be ill, or in danger, or heavy trouble, what has become of all these? And God himself has written us such wonderful letters about their home." This was a stretch of faith and love and hope to which I could not reach. But I longed for it, my very soul cried out after it. As I laid my head on my pillow that night, I inwardly resolved that I would have it, that I would watch her life and discover if I could from what source she drew her wellspring of joy and hope. End of chapter 20. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 21 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 21, in which class is not considered. Abbie vexed me the very next morning at the breakfast table. I looked to see her assume an air of distant dignity toward Mrs. Tyndall. I considered that I had sufficiently explained that lady's character to make it plain that she was not worthy the friendship of my cousin. I was therefore much surprised and chagrined to notice the bright, cordial greeting that Abbie bestowed upon her, and their conversation together was frank and cordial. Apparently Abbie was interested in everything that Mrs. Tyndall said, and entered with interest, even with eagerness, into the most trivial subjects. I felt very much disgusted with them both. I concluded that my cousin, who the night before had seemed to me almost an angel, was human like the rest of the world, and, of all faults, possessed the one that I detested the most, hypocrisy. She could not certainly admire Mrs. Tyndall. Indeed, she knew that lady's whole life to be at variance with her clearly defined views of right and wrong, and yet she affected to be pleased with her. I contented myself with maintaining a haughty silence, except when I was directly addressed, and even then I made my replies as brief and disagreeable as possible. And I verily thought that I was practicing one of the Christian virtues. I felt gratified, soon after, when Abbie graciously declined an invitation to ride with Mrs. Tyndall, and announced her intention of accompanying me to the shop. "What in the world are you going to do there?" our hostess questioned with wondering eyes. "Going to get acquainted," Abbie answered, flashing back a bright, roguish glance at the astonished lady from her blue eyes. And without further explanation she joined me. I experienced no little satisfaction in walking down Regent Street with my dainty little cousin. She was very simply dressed in a neat fitting street suit of heavy gray cloth, but everything about her was in such perfect keeping, so faultlessly new and perfect, from the delicately tinted kids that matched her suit to the exquisitely fitted walking boots; and about her entire person was that mysterious, unmistakable air of culture and style, that it seemed to me if she had been labeled "Direct from New York City," it could not have been more evident than it was now. There was a rustling among the boxes, and a general moving of things out of our way, when we reached the shop, that indicated the sort of impression that my visitor was making. I took her at once to my desk, and she followed my example in laying aside her things, and coolly announced her intention of spending the morning with me. I was puzzled to know what to do to entertain her. I need not have been. She had her own plans of entertainment, and carried them out. "Won't you make the tour of the rooms with me, when you have leisure, and introduce me to the girls?" she asked me suddenly, after a moment's study of the room and its inmates. I remember with what an air of amused superiority I answered her: "Why, my dear child, we don't introduce them, they never expect it; would be perfectly amazed if we did. If you want to ask them any questions about their work, you will not be obliged to wait for an introduction. Speak to whoever you please." Abbie surveyed me thoughtfully with her great blue eyes, but made no answer, and presently began to question me closely about the girls. "Julia, who is the one with hair combed plainly back, and with a little narrow collar and no bow?" "Frank Hooper. She's a character. Been spoiled, they say, by a flirtation with Mr. Sayles." "Did he flirt with her?" "I presume he did, thoughtlessly perhaps. Mrs. Tyndall says she flirted with him, but it is too great a stretch of charity to believe much that she says. Dr. Douglass says they were engaged, and that he deserted her when her father lost his property, but I don't believe that either." I said this with an air that betokened a lofty contempt for gossip of all sorts, but Abbie seemed not to have heard my last sentence. She was looking earnestly at Frank, and, as I finished my sentence, asked: "Is she a Christian?" "No, indeed, far enough from it. She is little better than a scoffer. Dr. Douglass has spasms of being deeply interested in her, but his interest doesn't seem to accomplish much." "Have you done all that you can for her, Julia?" I answered more faintly, but still steadily: "Yes, I have. I could do just nothing for her. She repelled every attempt." I was very sincere. I did not blush then, as I do now, in recalling this conversation. I firmly believe that girls of 16 haven't the slightest conception of what fools they are. Abbie's attention was by this time turned toward Caroline Brighton. She asked me as to her name, her character, the influence that surrounded her. I laughed as I answered the questions. It seemed natural for people to laugh when they talked about Caroline. "She is an embodied spirit of evil, I do believe," I said, still laughing. "She was never known to be interested in anything but mischief of the wildest and most daring nature." "What has her religious education been?" "I doubt whether she ever had any. At least, there is no present indication of any." Again my cousin's earnest eyes sought mine, and she spoke slowly and thoughtfully: "Do you think that is possible, Julia? She must have come in contact with Christian people, and they must have left their impress. For instance, she has come in daily contact with you, and of course you must have influenced her?" There was a questioning sound to her voice, but I had no reply to make. I think she had given me my first realizing sense of solemn responsibility. It was a new thought that my life, this past winter, must have been contributing to the religious education of Caroline Brighton. It was not a pleasant thought. I shivered under it, and spoke suddenly: "What a fearful thing you would make of life! If we can never come in contact with people without influencing them, I think most of us would pray to be delivered from people. Or else, feeling the unmeaningness of that, pray to be so enveloped with the Spirit of Christ that our influence would tell for Him." Mr. Jerome Sayles lounged in at that moment and interrupted further conversation. He brought a bouquet of exquisite hothouse plants in glorious bloom. He made a feint of counting the blossoms and dividing equally between us. Abbie was courteously grateful, but very full of her previous subject, and appealed to him. "We are talking of influence, Mr. Sayles, Christian influence. Isn't it true that every person of whom we come in contact influences us, more or less, and, if the person be a Christian, educates us in that direction?" Mr. Sayles was amusedly interested. "I'm not posted on that subject, you know," he said good-humoredly. "You must constantly remember that my education has been woefully neglected in that quarter. Won't you take me in hand and reform me?" But Abbie was persistently determined not to trifle with him, least of all on this subject. There was a sweet earnestness in her voice as she asked: "Is it really true that your Christian friends have made no impression on your mind as to their religious character, or that the impression they made has not in the least affected your life?" He became grave at once; his face even wore a troubled look as he answered: "They certainly have made marked and lasting impressions; but I have not profited by any of my lessons as I should. Perhaps you will teach me a better way of life?" If, as I strongly suspected, he was saying this for effect, my cousin was by no means disposed to talk sentiment with him, but turned promptly to another topic. "Mr. Sayles, are you acquainted with all these girls?" There was a glance of surprise at the sudden change of subject, a quick glance toward "the girls" whom the question indicated, a curious lifting of the eyebrows, a roguish look at me, all in a second of time, and he replied in his ordinary tone of indolent good humor: "I have that honor." "Then will you introduce me to each one of them?" Mr. Sayles bent an earnest, questioning look on her face, then his manner and tone changed, and he said in a serious, quiet voice: "Certainly I will, if you wish it." Abbie immediately arose, shook out the folds of her dress, and prepared to accompany him. They went at once toward Frank Hooper's corner, leaving me, meantime, in a state of absolute disgust. I was enraged with my cousin, with Mr. Sayles, and, more than all, with myself. It seemed incredible to me that in so short a time I could have sunken so low as to be ashamed of introducing a company of respectable girls to one who asked an introduction, my sole reason for declining being that the said girls worked in a shop. I thoroughly despised myself. I tried to discover how I came to indulge in such miserable pride. It was not difficult to trace the influence directly to Mrs. Tyndall, and as usual I seemed to forget that I could have had any influence over my own life, or could have found help that would have kept me from falling; so I went on cherishing a fierce and bitter feeling in my heart for her. Meantime I watched my cousin. Mr. Sayles presented her to the girls with all the courteous grace that he would have used in his intercourse with any lady, and Abbie's manner was equally far removed from patronage and hauteur. She was simply her sweet, graceful self, as thoroughly composed and at ease as if this were not a novel position to her. Frank Hooper was decidedly the haughtiest and most unbending of the two. Abbie lingered longest beside Caroline Brighton, seeming to find her the most communicative and agreeable. Mr. Sayles left her with Caroline, and sauntered back to me. "She is a very singular little lady," he said, watching her as she leaned against the table, apparently indifferent to paste and brushes, and carried on an animated conversation. "I wonder you didn't give us some idea of the unusual development of character." "I don't observe anything so very remarkable," I said stiffly, in some doubt as to whether his tone expressed admiration or amusement, and being prepared to resent either with an almost equal degree of earnestness. "Don't you?" he said, and he gave me the benefit of a very searching look. "That is strange. Now, I consider her the most remarkable young lady I have ever known. She really seems to be in earnest." My indignant answer was checked by my desire to hear the conversation between Abbie and Caroline. "Will you go?" Abbie questioned earnestly. "Really," Caroline answered, assuming most admirably the air of a modest, diffident young lady, "I would go with pleasure, but you see I am not in the habit of it, and I don't know any one to go with, and I should feel so queer and strange." Then Abbie's sweet, gentle voice: "I think you told me you lived on Jackson Street. Then you have to pass through Clinton Square to reach the church, do you not? My cousin pointed out the church to me at the upper end of the square. Then couldn't you call for me? I board at Mrs. Tyndall's, you know, and I should be so glad to have your company. We might all go together from there. Will you not come?" "I might do that," Caroline answered, meekly, her eyes meantime gleaming with mischief. "I do so wish you would. It would be very pleasant to us to have you come. May I expect you then?" "I think so. Shall I ask for you, Miss Ried?" "Yes, if you please. And if you can come a few minutes before the time we could have a little chance to get acquainted, and have a pleasant talk, perhaps." And then Abbie moved away, thanking her meantime as one who had conferred a favor, oblivious apparently to the conversation that immediately followed her departure, though I heard it distinctly. "Aren't you ashamed?" queried Caroline's next neighbor, a blunt-spoken, well-meaning sort of girl. "I wouldn't make game of any one who treated me as nice as that, I vow." "Hush," said Caroline gravely. "I'm to become a means of grace to Mrs. Tyndall. Don't you see? Imagine me seated in her elegant parlor, complacently awaiting the departure of the family for church. Isn't that jolly, though? A shop girl in her parlor! She'll have to clean house for a month after that." Then, in lower tone, but still distinctly, with a glance over her shoulder at Abbie: "Which is she, Vic, a greenie or a brick?" What was she, indeed? And where was all this to end? How would Mrs. Tyndall tolerate such introductions to her parlor? I felt troubled and provoked. "I don't know what to do with her," I said aloud and fretfully, and I couldn't decide whether Mr. Sayles' reply was intended to be soothing or sarcastic. "I wouldn't try to do anything with her, Julia. I fancy she is a person who will do for herself." There was certainly sensation enough as we lingered in the dining room that evening, and shortly after a furious ring at the front door, a servant announced, "Miss Brighton to see Miss Ried." It was almost a pity that Caroline could not have been present to enjoy the scene. "Miss Brighton? Who on earth is she?" speculated Mrs. Tyndall. "And which Miss Ried does she want? You, of course, Julia, but I don't recall the name. Have you an idea who it is?" I was in a blaze of confusion, but Abbie answered promptly and sweetly: "The message is for me, I presume, Mrs. Tyndall. It is one of the girls whom I met to day at the shop. She has come to accompany us to church this evening. I asked her to come in early. I wanted to get a little bit acquainted with her, so I will be excused at once." As the door closed after her, Mr. Sayles, whose presence was so constant now as to be considered a matter of course, studied for a moment Mrs. Tyndall's face, then burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. Peal after peal re-echoed through the room, and to the lady's annoyed question, "What on earth are you laughing at?" he only answered by a more hearty outburst than before. "This is as good as a first-class theater," he said, when he could speak again. "Come, Julia, take me to meeting with you this evening. I must see the fun out." Necessity sent us all shortly after to the parlor to receive other callers, and no greeting could have been more perfect in its way than the one that Mrs. Tyndall gave to the shop girl in answer to Abbie's introduction. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 22, in which the comfort of mourning is discussed. Our conversation that evening was as far as possible removed from what you would have supposed it would be after a return from a meeting fraught with deep and solemn interests. As usual, Mrs. Tyndall was not present, and was apparently not in the least interested in that matter. The parlor doors stood invitingly open as we entered the hall, and the lady of the house called to us with a sort of languid mirth to take pity on her, and come and help her entertain her husband, as she was tired to death over the effort of trying to keep him from straying away to the reading room or some other tiresome place. So we all went in, Mrs. Tyndall giving most cordially the invitation to Mr. Sayles which Abbie and I had intended to withhold, as we wanted to go directly to our room. As it was, Abbie demurred, but I, unable to resist the temptation of the brilliant room and the company of Mr. Sayles, said, "Let us stop a few minutes," and almost the next sentence that was spoken started our topic of conversation, or rather of debate. "Julia, that shade of drab is exceedingly unbecoming to you," Mrs. Tyndall said, surveying me critically. "Did you ever see your cousin in pink, Miss Ried? She has a peculiar shade of pink that she wears sometimes, which is exceedingly becoming to her. I really wish you could see her in it. But of course she doesn't feel like wearing such bright colors now, poor child." This last with a little sigh and a lowering of the voice. The tone and the sigh irritated me strangely. I replied sharply: "I feel quite as much like wearing pink as ever I did. I'm sure I don't know why I should not." Mrs. Tyndall turned at once to my cousin. "Do you consider it the unpardonable sin to wear mourning, Miss Ried?" Abbie lifted very grave, very wondering eyes to Mrs. Tyndall's face, but answered quietly, "No, ma'am." "Then this child is not a disciple of yours. She has taken up the most unaccountable hobby of late, really gets quite excited about the matter, and, any one can see, does violence to her own feelings all the time. I really feel that her grief would not seem so heavy on her if she would not fight against nature in this way. Don't you think so?" Abbie smiled pleasantly, and answered promptly, "If there is a fight at all, Mrs. Tyndall, I should call it a fight against fashion, not against nature." Mrs. Tyndall emphatically shook her head. "I should not. It is just as natural to wish to wrap ourselves in black when we are in affliction, as it is to eat when we are hungry." "But, Mrs. Tyndall, suppose it was the fashion when our friends went away, to attire ourselves in brilliant red, do you imagine that we would follow what was natural to ourselves, or what fashion dictated?" "It never will be the fashion, Miss Ried. Black always was and always will be the natural mourning costume. It would be an offense against nature to have it otherwise; and fashion, after all, must follow nature to be accepted. For instance, when she orders waists to become 6¼ inches in circumference, and monstrosities resembling inverted coal scuttles to be attached to the back of the head, what becomes of nature then?" This from Mr. Sayles in good-humored sarcasm. Mrs. Tyndall promptly hushed him. "Now, Jerome, don't you interfere. Being a man, you must rail against the fashions, of course; all men do. But I think there is an immense amount of nonsense talked about these same fashions." "I heartily prescribe to that sentiment," Mr. Tyndall interposed, rousing up from his half-buried position in the easy-chair. "If you want to appreciate the force of it, Sayles, marry a wife, and go with her to all the millinery establishments in town, and wait while she tries rainbow-colored patches on her head, and calls them bonnets. That's what I've been about all this mortal day." "Now, Mr. Tyndall, I wasn't in Madame Darrow's 20 minutes, I don't think." "An hour and 3/4 by my watch." Amid the general laugh that followed, Mrs. Tyndall continued: "That's of no consequence, anyway; has nothing to do with the subject. What I want to know is, why is it such a fearfully wicked thing to wear mourning?" "It isn't, is it?" queried Abbie, in gentle tone. "Some people seem to think so, and you yourself don't think it right, at least I don't believe you do. Honestly, now, do you?" Thus pressed, Abbie answered simply: "It would not be right for me, because personally I do not approve of it; but I accord to every one the privilege of deciding the question for himself." "But, do just tell me what possible harm there can be in it. I really am curious to know." There was a little flush on Abbie's cheek, but her tone was as quiet as ever. "There is the objection that lies directly on the surface, Mrs. Tyndall, the unnecessary and heavy expense, and the heavy drain that it brings on the purses of the poor." Mrs. Tyndall shook her emphatic head. "That wouldn't have the least weight in the world with me. I consider the starting point extremely false. There is no necessity for the poor aping us in that matter more than in 100 others. On that principle I could not have a silk dress, because my cook can't afford one." "Bad illustration, Mrs. Tyndall," interposed Mr. Sayles. "I am witness that only last Sunday your cook flamed out in a red and green plaid, and you yourself told me that the material was silk." Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "Oh, they will copy us just as far as they are able, there is no question about that," she said, pleasantly. "But, Miss Ried, you haven't given me any arguments yet. This one has no weight with me." "It has with me," Abbie answered, with quiet earnestness. "You and I would very possibly not agree on the silk dress question either, but I don't consider the illustration a fair one. If we accept black clothes as marks of respect for our dead, and as tokens of grief, I object to them on the ground that my poorer sister carries just as heavy a heart in her affliction as I do in mine, and in following the prevailing custom, I am but giving her one more temptation to do the same. My creed is that we should not even in so small a matter as that of dress lead others astray." "Miss Ried, you amaze me," interrupted Mr. Tyndall. "You are the very first lady I ever met who considered dress a small matter. The most of them have it in their catechisms that it is the end for which they were created." Abbie turned toward him with a bright little laugh. "I am a very small body, you know," she said gaily. But Mrs. Tyndall brought them back sharply to the point at issue. "Miss Ried," she said, I hope you will excuse me, but I think that it is nonsense, all that about leading people astray. I don't profess to lead anybody. I dress as I please, and other people have a perfect right to do the same. But I would like to know, just for curiosity's sake, if that is all the objection you have to black clothes." "Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God," quoted Abbie softly; and then, looking at Mrs. Tyndall, "No, ma'am, I have other objections. To me it doesn't seem a good way in which to cultivate a Christian spirit. It has its rise in heathenism in the first place. Has it not, Mr. Sayles?" "A Christian spirit!" echoed Mrs. Tyndall, in great amazement, ignoring Abbie's question. "What on earth has a Christian spirit to do with the color of one's dress? Now, Miss Ried, take yourself for an example. You have lost a friend, I think I have heard. Don't you truly feel at any time as though you would not wear your bright colored dresses any more? As though you must wrap yourself in black?" I turned quickly to see how Abbie bore this cool-blooded reference to her one great sorrow. The red had faded a little from her cheek, but she answered in the same sweet, steady tone: "Yes, ma'am, I did. There were times I felt that all the world ought to robe itself in black because of my sorrow. There were times when it seemed to me the sun ought not to shine, nor the birds to sing, and that no one anywhere ought to be glad and happy any more. Do you think I would have been justified in indulging those thoughts?" "That, of course, was an exaggeration of grief. But what possible harm could it have done to yield to your very natural desire to dress yourself in nothing but black?" "Mrs. Tyndall, to me that desire seems a part of the same idea, only not carried to so great a degree. I realized that as a Christian it was my duty to remember constantly that my best and dearest friend, even my Savior, had sent my sorrow to me, and that it was in some way unknown to me the best that could come to me. I knew it was my duty to teach my naturally rebellious heart to say, 'Thy will be done,' to check all murmurings, all bitterness; and trying to do this it seemed to me that it would not be a help but a contradiction, while the spirit was struggling for calmness and peace, to clothe the body in gloom, and move about the world a living witness, not to the goodness, but the severity of God." "Yet people must miss their friends, and must grieve over their loss," Mrs. Tyndall said, in a subdued, thoughtful tone, such as she rarely used. Abbie answered very earnestly: "Indeed it must be so while the body holds us; but the grief is heavy enough without seeking by all possible outward signs to press it more heavily upon the weary spirit. I think the whole system of wearing mourning for our dead is productive of two results. To the young and frivolous, when the grief has not been heavy, it affords occupation for the mind, and leads their thoughts hopelessly away from what might otherwise have been a solemn and lasting impression, to the business of plunging the body into the outward mockery of deep grief. And to those whose hearts seem almost broken the custom intrudes, obliging them to think of and plan about petty and exasperating details of dress, and affords them merely the poor solace of nursing the heavy gloom that sometimes sweeps over them when they seem given over to wild, rebellious thoughts." "It's a queer business, the whole of it," Mr. Tyndall exclaimed, breaking in upon the little silence that fell between us at the conclusion of Abbie's earnest words. "I don't know another thing in the whole fashionable world so open to criticism and to ridicule as those proprieties that obtain in our set on the subject of mourning. Was it ever your ill luck to meet a grand lady in full array, crape, bombazine, bugles, and what not, and all for a rich old aunt or uncle that she hated with all the strength of her civilized, Christianized heart? I think that's enough to put the whole thing out of fashion." "People can counterfeit anything," Mrs. Tyndall said apathetically. "I don't think I had much temptation to follow the custom," Abbie continued. "It has, as you say, Mr. Tyndall, its ludicrous side, too distinctly marked if one notices and thinks about it much to accord with deep, real sorrow. I have seen it too often, when it seemed to me but a solemn mockery." "I think it is perfectly natural to desire to wear mourning when one loses a friend." Mrs. Tyndall said this just as positively and quietly as if she had not said the same thing in substance every 5 minutes since the conversation commenced. She had a very provoking way of earthing up the old argument that you supposed you had killed and buried, and presenting it as something new and brilliant. I have seen people since who argued in precisely the same way. Abbie answered her as sweetly as if she had never heard that opinion expressed before. Do you think it is perfectly natural to continue to wear it, Mrs. Tyndall?" "I don't understand your question, my dear," Mrs. Tyndall answered, with equal gentleness. "Why, to continue wearing black on and on for years and years, from girlhood until one is an old woman, or until she dies. Would that seem natural?" "Why, no, of course not. After a proper length of time one ought to lay it aside, of course." "That brings us to a point that is exceedingly trying to me. Who has given the world a right to say to us, 'There, you have mourned long enough. It is a year now since that grave was closed. Yesterday it was perfectly right and proper for you to be wrapped in black, but today get out your blue and pink and scarlet, and be gay again.'" "What a queer way of putting it," said Mrs. Tyndall, and she laughed her sweet, silvery laugh. "And yet time does heal over heavy wounds." It was Mr. Sayles who said this, but I turned to look at him in order to be certain. The voice was so unlike his, so gentle and tender, almost pleading in its earnest questioning. Abbie answered quickly: "It does indeed, or how could any of us live? But it would be very hard for me to be dictated to even in this; to be told that such and such things are not in keeping with my mourning, if they were in keeping with my heart. I like God's way best, that of teaching the Christian heart in its sorrow to rest on Him, and go bravely, earnestly, cheerfully about life's duties and cares, yes, and joys, waiting patiently for the rest that such a life will bring, rather than the world's way, which says, 'Here, to day you must wear crape, and you must make no calls, no, even on your best friends, because you are in mourning; but to morrow you can dress yourself in spangles and go whither you will. It will not be necessary for you to show respect to your dead any more.' If it is a mark of respect to my dead, who are tonight in heaven, to shut myself in from human sympathies and human pleasures, and robe myself in gloom, I for one won't do it forever, not for a year, or 2 years, or 6 months, as fashion may dictate. But if, as I believe, it is not only showing more respect to the Christian dead, but more submissive love to the God who called them from us, to go bravely about our usual work, taking what joys we can find, bearing with what lightenings we may, our heavy crosses of pain, why, I want to do that." She rose as she spoke, and having finished her sentence smiled and bowed a gentle good night. "Jerome," said Mrs. Tyndall solemnly, "Miss Ried has undoubtedly been very eloquent. I appreciate her efforts on my behalf, but nevertheless, when I die I want you to wear crape on your hat for me." "I'll do so with pleasure, Mrs. Tyndall," he answered gravely, with a profound bow. "I assure you there shall not be so much as an inch of the original hat left to view. With this solemn and utterly undeniable proof will I attest my appreciation of your worth." Then he held open the door for Abbie and myself to pass, giving us only a grave, respectful bow for good night, while Mr. Tyndall was exploding with laughter over his last remark. Chapter 23 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 23, in which I prove the truth of an old adage. The meetings closed, not because the special interest had entirely abated, but because Dr. Mulford was utterly worn out with his long continued extra labors, and body and brain absolutely demanded rest. Meantime, in a quiet, almost unnoticed way, the work went on. The young people's meeting was largely attended, and Dr. Douglass came home, often with glowing face, to tell of some new trophy. Abbie attended these meetings a great deal; I, only occasionally; for my health during all the wear and pressure of this winter was anything but firm, and I was often obliged to rest quietly at home when I would gladly have gone. Dr. Douglass had also started a young men's prayer meeting, in which he was deeply interested. Meantime Abbie was busy. Her energy was unflagging; she became a power in our shop, could coax the girls into anything that she wanted done, always excepting Frank Hooper, who held haughtily aloof. The change was more marked in Caroline Brighton than in any one else. I remember that the morning after Abbie had told me of the decided stand that she took in the young people's meeting, I looked upon her with absolute awe. It seemed so wonderful to me that the Spirit of God could descend upon and transform such a one as she. For myself, I was very far away from happiness or peace. I still industriously studied my Bible. I still struggled wearily through my stated seasons of prayer. I still clung to my virtuous indignation over Mrs. Tyndall, and still held stated and solemn and shocked talks with Frank Hooper, in which she answered me after the old fashion, half haughty, half comic, wholly indifferent. We came home one afternoon, Abbie and I, earlier by an hour than usual. Abbie had called for me, and I got excused to go with her to look after one of her Sunday school scholars. We came down, ready for our walk, and as we reached the hall Abbie said, "There, I have forgotten the cards that I was going to take the child. Wait here, Julia, and I will run back for them." I dropped wearily into one of the hall seats, and listened to the hum of conversation in the parlor, unconscious that I was listening until I heard my own name, spoken in Mrs. Tyndall's voice. "Julia Ried, her name is. Her mother is a poor widow, and well, the fact is, that she is simply a shop girl. We call her a clerk, out of regard to her feelings. She does help about the books, I believe; but then, that is a distinction without a difference, you know. She works all day in the shop, and that is all there is about it." "And boards with you!" The tone expressed a whole volume of exclamation points. "And boards with me. That is comical, isn't it?" "But how in the world did it ever happen?" "Well, there was a little bit of harmless deception practiced in the first place. Dr. Douglass coaxed me into taking her. He is an old acquaintance of the family, I believe, and looks after this girl a good deal. He is really very kind to her. Well, he led me to think that she was a school girl. I don't remember his precise language now, and it's of no consequence. He was quite sharp about it, anyway. Never gave me an idea as to her position, and of course I thought it was all right; and Mr. Tyndall was obliged to be absent a good deal, so I decided to take her for company." "How perfectly comical!" "Isn't it? I felt vexed at first, and disposed to send her away at once; but Mr. Tyndall said, nonsense, and what difference did it make? His way, you know. Nothing ever makes any difference with him. So she just stayed on, and has ever since, owing to my natural indolence and dread of scenes." "But she goes out a great deal with the family, does she not?" "Yes, constantly. That's force of circumstances, too. She is Dr. Douglass' friend, you know, and his position is entirely beyond question. Besides, we like her. We do, really. I have had a sort of fancy for her all along, and Mr. Tyndall is very much attached to her." "But who is this cousin of hers? A shop girl, too?" "Not by any means. She is of a very different grade. Why, don't you think she is Ralph Ried's daughter, of New York, the firm of Ried, Wilkinson & Company, you know." "And the other one is her cousin?" "Her own cousin. She seems very fond of her, too. So you see I was wise after all in not yielding to my first impulses. I think, very likely, it is only a sort of girlish freak, her being a shop girl at all; though she is quite poor. We have given her a number of things." "What about Mr. Sayles? He seems to be quite attentive." Mrs. Tyndall laughed her low, silvery laugh, and answered, "Oh, well, you know Jerome. He must flirt, and she will do as well as any one." Up to this point I had been listening to this interesting conversation in that idiotic way that people sometimes do, without fully taking in the fact that it was not intended for my ears, or even fully comprehending that I was the person who was being discussed. But at the mention of Mr. Sayles' name, I roused into eager attention, with a wild desire to hear more; and at the same time there rushed upon me a realization of the fact that I, Julia Ried, my honored mother's daughter, had actually turned eavesdropper! I sprang up and fled away up the stairs. Abbie spoke to me as I opened the door. "Did you tire of waiting, Julia? I don't wonder; I am sorry to be so tardy. But, do you know, I can't think what can have become of those cards. I thought I knew just where they were, and they are perversively nowhere. I think we shall have to go without them." Then she turned toward me, and uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Why, Julia, my dear child, what has happened? Your face is perfectly colorless. What is it?" "It is very little." I tried to say it coolly, but I was really trembling with indignation, and then I burst forth my torrent of pent-up rage, giving her, with much excitement and many interpolations as to my opinion, the entire story. She treated it and me in a very different manner from what I had expected. As soon as she discovered that no one was dead or dying, She turned back to her trunk, and continued to search for the missing cards, giving me good attention, however, and, when I made a sort of breathless pause, said coolly: "My dear Julia, you seem surprised." "Surprised?" I repeated excitedly. "I should think I might be. It was no agreeable thing to sit in that hall and hear such an exasperating account given of one's self and one's friends." "Not agreeable, I grant you, but I don't see why it should surprise you." "Abbie, what do you mean?" "Why, dear Julia, think a minute. Did you ever, in your life, hear her speak well of an absent person? Don't you know you told me, the other day, that she had given you a queer opinion of every single person about whom you had heard her talk? Now, why should you have expected to escape this general maelstrom of talk? Don't you know, when a person entertains you with the faults and failings and peculiarities of your friends, that your turn for being discussed is sure to come?" "But she said such mean, untrue things," I answered, still speaking in excitement and anger. "If she had only had the decency to tell the truth, I should not have minded what she said." "Have you reason to think that she has always been strictly truthful in regard to what she has told you of others?" I reflected. There was Mrs. Mulford, and Dr. Mulford, and Frank Hooper, and Mrs. Carson, and oh, hosts of others. What queer things had she told me about them? Things that I more than half suspected at the time, and knew now, were at least colored. "Besides," said Abbie, finding that I did not speak, "let us have a real plain little talk, you and I. You say she did not speak the truth. She said, among other things, that you were a shop girl. Now please tell me what those two words mean. Don't they mean that a girl is employed in a shop? What is there that is not perfectly right and proper in that? And isn't it just the truth? Haven't you been so employed during the winter?" I winced a little. I had made a distinction. I had not called myself a shop girl. I had not treated the others as though they belonged to my class. "It means a lower class of persons," I said, somewhat sullenly. "No, it doesn't, dear, not the mere name, any more than music teacher means any particular style of person. If a good many ignorant girls have earned their living in shops, until we have come to associate the name with the ignorant and coarse, that is our blunder, and a very foolish one, I think it. Isn't it a strange idea that we cannot tell whether a person is a lady or not until we can discover what she chances to do with her hands and brain?" "Oh, you don't carry out your own ideas," I said, taking up Mrs. Tyndall's style of reasoning, and using one of her old arguments. "You don't associate with Mrs. Tyndall's cook, or go out calling with her." "Neither is necessary in order to maintain my position. Mrs. Tyndall's cook is not fitted by education and habit to enjoy going out calling with me. She would be neither comfortable nor happy. But suppose she chooses to improve her opportunities, and lift herself up to education and refinement, do you suppose I would decline her society because she used to cook my dinners? I should despise such reasoning, and so should anybody." I smiled a little in spite of my anger. This sweet, pure cousin of mine did not understand some things so well as I, with my 16 years of wisdom, if she did not know that half the women in Christendom would do just that thing. Abbie had talked herself into an enthusiasm, and she added: "I don't like all this talk about class and grade in this country of ours. It is an intensely un-American idea, in a land where the shop girl of today may be the wife of the President tomorrow. But we are running away from the question." She added laughingly: "Dear Julia, don't think I am unsympathetic. Only I wouldn't mind so much. She did not say anything so very wicked after all, when one takes into consideration her manner of talking." "But," I said with hesitation, and in a voice that was very near tears, "I thought she liked me. I did, really." "And you admit that she said she did. No doubt she does. I think she is very fond of you." "What is such fondness worth?" I said scornfully. "It is worth quite as much as it receives from you, I think. Don't you see, Julia, what a curious thing you are doing? You are overcome with indignation because of what you have overheard her say. Now, just imagine that she could have repeated to her, accurately and in detail, everything that you have told me about her, what sort of a state of mind do you think she would be in?" I had no definite answer to make to this. In truth, it startled me a little. I was somewhat surprised to discover that while I had several times frankly stated that I detested her entire character, I meantime expected her to go on liking me just as well as ever. "She said such mean things about Dr. Douglass," I exclaimed after a little silence, waxing indignant again. "Dr. Douglass will not mind it in the least," Abbie answered coolly. This was true. He certainly would not, and as I thought of the very composed, even amused, air with which he would have listened to the entire story, it served to quiet me more than anything else had done. But I immediately fell into speculation over what had been mysterious to me for several days. I made my thoughts known suddenly. "I don't in the least understand you, Abbie. Do you admire Mrs. Tyndall's character?" She answered my question frankly enough. "No, Julia, I cannot say that I do." "Well, do you know you act as though you did? You always treat her as if you liked her very much, and I don't understand why it isn't hypocritical." She answered me with a mischievous glance from her blue eyes, as she said: "Do you think I should exhibit a more consistent Christian character if I said frankly, 'Mrs. Tyndall, I don't like you in the least. I think you are a very absurd woman, and I cannot treat you with any sort of respect?'" Precisely the style of question that she once asked me when we were talking about sincerity. But it doesn't help me in the least. Of course we can't talk in that manner to people, and yet that way would be sincere, and the other way is hypocritical. I don't see but it follows that people have got to be hypocritical, anyhow." Abbie was very earnest and gentle now. "Dear Julia, don't you think the mistake comes in further back? Ought such uncharitable conclusions to be my sincere state of mind toward Mrs. Tyndall? Ought I not rather to cultivate a tender spirit toward her, a spirit that will lead me, not to dwell upon her faults, but to be on the alert for her virtues? Thoughts about the shortcomings of others are very eager to gain admittance to my heart, but ought I to cherish them, or turn from them and cultivate a prayerful spirit toward the people who call them forth? If I am striving to do that, is it not a help to me to meet them on common ground whenever I can, to enjoy every bit that is enjoyable about them, and love everything that is lovable? Isn't that the better way?" This was high ground. I could not reach up to it, so I made the defiant and rather irrelevant answer: "I don't love her, anyway." Abbie had long since ceased fumbling in her trunk, and was curled on a soft cushion at my feet while she talked. She laid her head on my lap in a pretty, coaxing way she had, and said softly: "I wish you did not feel just as you do about Mrs. Tyndall. I don't think it is possible to live close to Jesus and cherish such feelings. Shall not you and I reform in this matter?" "I can't," I said stoutly. "I cannot feel rightly toward her. You may perhaps; you have never had any provocation for feeling otherwise." "There is one sure way in which to cultivate right feeling, Julia. Suppose we make her a special and constant and earnest subject of prayer, not spasmodically, as we may chance to feel like it, but with all our hearts bent on her attaining a higher life." "I should never feel like it, I am afraid," I said coldly. "I don't think she is a Christian at all." Abbie slowly raised her head and fixed eyes full of wonder on my face. "Does that thought preclude the possibility of praying for her, Julia? First, you know we have nothing to do with that, and, in either case, what then? If she is, does she not need a rebaptism? Do you not desire it for her? If she is not, does she not need Jesus? Do you not desire her conversion? In either case, cannot you pray?" I was entirely silent. There seemed nothing left to say. After a few minutes Abbie added: "I do not think of Mrs. Tyndall as you do. I think she is a lady very much given to using her tongue. I don't think she means more than half she says, and I don't think she realizes a quarter of the mischief that she does with her tongue." "I do," I answered briefly and bitterly. Just then the tea bell pealed through the house, and we laid aside hats and sacks and went down to tea. Chapter 24. Of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 24, in which is a surprise and a blessing. One evening we were all in the parlor, Mr. and Mrs. Tyndall, Abbie and I. Mr. Sayles had been spending the evening with us, but had just left. The spell being broken, I was in haste to get to my room, but Abbie lingered and talked with Mrs. Tyndall about her worsted dog in an exasperatingly interested way. Mr. Tyndall was in a most unusual mood for him, silent and grave. He had not been with us during the evening, but had recently arrived, and since his entrance had spoken very few words, but had kept up a steady monotonous walk up and down the room. The walking seemed to disturb Mrs. Tyndall, for presently she said, half playfully, half in earnest: "Mr. Tyndall, what in the world has come over you, or overcome you, as our old woman who talked in meeting used to say? I never knew you to pace up and down the room in that solemn fashion before." At this question he paused half irresolutely for a moment, then went over to her with a determined air and spoke, in tones somewhat husky: "Fanny, I have something I want to say to you." "Well," she answered, still playfully, but with a sort of wondering tone, "is that a fact so unusual and remarkable that it needs a preface? Don't go, girls," as Abbie and I arose to depart. "It isn't a private lecture, is it, Mr. Tyndall?" still speaking very merrily. His face was very pale, but he answered, steadily: "No, it is not private. No, Julia, no, Miss Ried, please remain. I trust I am not ashamed of what I am about to say. Fanny, I ought to have told you of it before, but I did not seem able to. These past weeks have been very eventful ones to me. You remember, perhaps, Miss Ried, that you asked me to go to the young men's prayer meeting 2 weeks ago last Tuesday night. Did you pray for me that evening?" "Yes," said Abbie, "all the evening." He turned to her with a bright smile lighting up his pale face as he said, earnestly: "For which I shall have reason to thank you through all eternity. Well, Fanny, it is a long story, the history of these 2 weeks. It has been a long 2 weeks to live and to fight," he added, drawing a quick, hard breath. "To fight with pride, and unbelief, and temptation in every fiendish form that can be imagined. But there has been a victory. I stood up in the meeting this evening, and told the people of my determination to begin now to follow Christ; and as they tell me the right way to begin is to do the first duty that offers, I have promised my Saviour that I would own him before you as a family to night. Fanny, I want to have family worship." Had the marble statue in the niche behind him been suddenly gifted with life and voice, it doesn't seem to me that I could have been more astonished. I looked up at the pale, resolute face with such a new feeling of respect welling up in my heart for him. What a wonderful thing it was, this new life born into the soul, changing all its springs, quickening all its impulses! Abbie's face was absolutely radiant, but she did not speak. We both waited in silence and no little anxiety for what Mrs. Tyndall might be moved to say. How would she receive this news? Such was my opinion of her that it seemed almost impossible that she should care. Indeed, I expected to hear her gaily pronounce him a victim to overwrought nerves, and propose a quiet night's rest, and the benefit of her society. I had been fascinated with the new look on Mr. Tyndall's face, but now I turned suddenly to watch his wife. There was a little pink flush on either cheek, a strange light in her eyes, and a new tone to her voice, such at least as I had never heard her use before. She laid her hand with a caressing movement on her husband's arm, and said in a voice as low and sweet as a silver bell: "Robert, I am very glad," with a marked, tremulous emphasis on the very. Then immediately she became mistress of this new situation. Rising, she moved composedly across the room and wheeled forward the little table on which the elegant Bible always reposed in undisturbed peace, said in her usual tone, as she pushed an easy chair toward me: "Take this chair, Julia, you look tired," then settled back among her cushions with an air of quiet waiting. Such was the peculiar effect of all this, that had a stranger come among us just then, I am sure he would have supposed that it was an ordinary everyday custom in this household to gather together for family worship. Her manner seemed to have a quieting effect on Mr. Tyndall. He took up the Bible with quiet, reverent hand, and read a few verses in a steady voice. Wonderful verses they were. I wondered if he had just chanced at that time to alight on them, or if they had met some of the great needs which he must have had during the 2 weeks of conflict. In any case, I thought they must be very wonderful verses to him. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Only a few verses, but how full they were of strength, of help, of promise! Over this one he paused, and finally read it again, with a ring of solemn triumph in his voice: "When thou saidst, Seek ye my face, My heart said unto thee, Thy face, Lord, will I seek. Then he closed the Bible, and we all knelt to pray. I am sure we can none of us ever forget that prayer. It was very brief, very simple, but it had the sound of that ancient prayer in the record, As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It was a plain, solemn, unreserved consecration of himself, and all that he called his, to the service of God. There was still an unusual pallor on his face when we arose from our knees, but the prayer seemed to have changed him. There was an added dignity about his manner, as that of a man who had at last assumed his proper position in his family, priest of his own household. Mrs. Tyndall bade us good night with her usual graceful air of composure, and I was somewhat divided as to which ought to astonish me most, Mr. Tyndall or his wife. Just before he left the parlor he had come over to Abbie, and, holding out his hand, said, earnestly, "I owe thanks to you, next to God, for the peace that I have to-night." "Isn't it blessed, Julia? Isn't it glorious?" Abbie said, with shining eyes and glowing cheeks, as the door closed after us in our own room. "But oh, Julia, to think that his wife could not have the joy of thinking that she led him to Jesus!" "I didn't know that you had ever said 20 words to him except at table," I answered, wondering to what he could have referred. "I am not sure that I did say 20. I had just a 3 minutes' talk with him one evening. When Dr. Douglass and I were coming home from prayer meeting, he overtook us just at the corner, and Dr. Douglass left me in his care and went to make a professional call. I had been thinking about him all the evening, principally because I knew the doctor had him so constantly on his heart. I had been praying for him, and I simply told him so. He thinks I was the means of helping him, because his heart was just ready to be helped at that time, but I did nothing. It is Dr. Douglass who has just carried him on his heart for months. He is a grand man, Julia. But oh, do you know, I think I am foolish? I am sure Mrs. Tyndall's heart must be just as full of joy as it can bear, but I cannot help feeling that if I had a husband who was not a Christian, it would be such a regret to me that I was not the one chosen to introduce him to Jesus." "Do you suppose she cares?" I asked, incredulously. "Wasn't she equal to the occasion, though? If there should an earthquake swallow us up, house and all, don't you believe she would shake out her robes, after the first surprise was over, and wheel forward an easy chair for somebody? I declare I don't know whether instead of being sorry that her life has been such that he never could have got into the right road if he had followed her, she is not at this very moment telling him, in a private, confidential way, that he has made a goose of himself, and that it is nothing but an injudicious excitement." However, I did not feel all the gaiety of manner that I exhibited. In reality, my heart felt very sore. It seemed strange to me that a man like Mr. Tyndall, who a few days before was even almost a scoffer in a gentlemanly way, could to-night express such a sense of love and trust and nearness to his Saviour, while I, who for years had professed to love and trust him, felt so far away. It seemed almost unjust. I was glad for Mr. Tyndall, but bitterly sorry for myself. Looking back now, on my life at that time, I think one of the marked and never to be forgotten lessons of that period was that a child of God cannot live for weeks and months in a whirl of daily excitement and eager chase after pleasure, neglecting her seasons of communion, or at best giving but a passing moment now and then to her Bible and her prayers, without bringing darkness on her own soul, a darkness that is sometimes long and exceedingly bitter to be borne. I know I shed bitter tears that night. When I knelt to pray, my prayer was only weeping. It seemed to me that I could not long endure this pain, yet I bore it quite alone. I said not a word to Abbie. Beyond the few words wrung from me by Dr. Douglass, I had let no one suppose other than I was at rest and peace. On Thursday evening we all went to prayer meeting together. It had been Mrs. Tyndall's custom to attend the Thursday evening meeting when it did not rain, and she was not too tired, and did not consider it her duty to stay with her husband, but to have him accompany her was an entirely new experience. There was an unusually large attendance, and many glances of surprise were interchanged when Mr. Tyndall followed us down the aisle. The Tyndall pew joined the Simons pew on the other side, and Lycia sat in the corner next to Mrs. Tyndall. She had attended quite regularly for several weeks, but had evinced no other interest. While the first hymn was being sung, Mr. Sayles sauntered in, and took the seat back of us. His presence, too, was unusual, although he had been once or twice before. The early part of the meeting was one of great suffering to me. The weight of gloom that had rested on my heart for weeks had grown almost insupportable during the past 2 days. I had tried, I thought, in every way to lift the burden. I had studied Abbie to see where lay the secret of her peace. I thought one of the marked features of her life was her constant work for the Master. She seemed always to have some one in mind to pray for, to speak a word to, as she had opportunity, but I had tried that and failed. I tried again. My desires seemed to cling to Frank Hooper. I spoke with her again, and was repulsed more decidedly than before. I know now that I did not talk with her, I preached at her. I tried once or twice to pray for Mrs. Tyndall, but now I can see very plainly that I prayed for her as a creature immensely below myself in her Christian life, if she had any, and half despised her even while I prayed. On this particular evening my misery was at its height. I remember I bowed my head on the seat in front of me, and struggled to keep my tears under control. There seemed a peculiar solemnity about all the exercises. Those who prayed spoke as if they felt almost the invisible presence of the King. I noticed this, and it served to deepen my own sense of something as great as an ocean sweeping between us. Presently Dr. Mulford's voice and question arrested my attention. There was a happy ring to his voice, as of one whose pulses were thrilling with a new joy, as he asked, "Will our brother Tyndall pray?" There was a sudden rustling of heads, that peculiar murmur of sound that flows over an astonished congregation, and then that equally peculiar silence settling over them as the new voice filled the house with prayer. What Mrs. Tyndall felt during that prayer only God and she knew, but it seemed to me that my own heart would break. There was such a sense of security in his words, such a realization of the presence of his Savior. I longed for it so. I cried out after it, but could not find it. What passed after that prayer I do not know. There was some talking and another prayer, but I don't know what was said. I was struggling with my own heart. But I heard Dr. Mulford when he spoke again. There may be those present tonight, Christians by profession, who know little in their own hearts of that peace of which our brother Tyndall spoke, and which God in his mercy has so recently given him. They may be conscious of having lived very far away, unworthy lives. They may be saying at this moment, "Oh, for a closer walk with God." Perhaps such an one would like us to pray for him or her, would like to say that our prayers are asked, that there may be a renewal of covenant vows, a reconsecration of heart to the Lord. If there be such person or persons present, will they not manifest their desire by rising? Could Dr. Mulford have expressed my feelings better if he had known the entire workings of my heart? I did want them to pray for me. I needed their prayers. I felt my own utter sinfulness, felt it that evening as I never had before. And yet it seemed to me as if I could not say so, could not rise up before that assembly and proclaim my sins. I even reasoned over the evil effect it would have. There were Mr. Sayles and Lycia Simons, and I didn't know how many others, who believed me to be a Christian. They knew nothing about my miserable backsliding. What a comment it would be on the professions of church members if I noised it abroad in this way! Thus I reasoned, and the opportunity passed. Then again the bitterness of desolation rolled over me. While they were singing a hymn, I felt that I would give anything to have the chance now to rise. No matter about anything, or what anybody thought, if only they would pray for me. I was a poor sinful, unhappy soul, and people must think what they would, so I could but get some help. My sincerity was to be tested. When the hymn closed, Dr. Mulford renewed the opportunity, saying he felt impressed that there were those present who were grieving the Spirit by going contrary to their convictions of duty. There was a little rustle beside me. I glanced up, and Mrs. Tyndall was standing. Now nothing could amaze me more than this. It seemed so entirely unlike Mrs. Tyndall, her elegant, composed way of doing everything, her utter disgust at anything unfeminine. Yet there she stood, pale, grave, and with a sort of beseeching earnestness in her face. It took but a second of time in which to think all these thoughts. The next I stood beside her. I don't clearly know about the rest of this portion of the meeting. There were others who arose, and then there were prayers offered, earnest, pleading ones. I recognized Dr. Douglas's voice, and the prayer he offered was such an one as I had never heard before. I read when I was a child the story of Bunyan's Pilgrim. I remember at the time being greatly impressed with the scene wherein his pack dropped off and left him free. I thought of it that evening. I felt that I could realize something of Christian's feeling. The burden was gone. A sinner I felt myself. Oh, I knew that more fully, more plainly than I had ever known it in my life before. But I was a sinner forgiven. My Savior held my hand. End of chapter 24. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 25 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 25, in which there is much joy and some work. Oh, how I enjoyed the remainder of that meeting! My heart felt ready to sing with gladness. Once more I felt the special presence of my Savior. The long, dark night of gloom was gone. Now let me not be misunderstood. I do not mean that the mere act of rising in prayer meeting dispelled the cloud that had so long brooded over me. I mean that my life during that time had for weeks been one of rebellion. I was secretly questioning the justice, the goodness of God. I wanted, moreover, to fight my battles alone. I did not want to admit to any one that I had wandered. I think God called for this act of submission on my part. I mean that I think he chose this particular form of submission for me, and so pressed it upon my conscience that for me to have resisted it would have been a sin. Dr. Mulford gave another invitation just before the close of the meeting. I remember how full of feeling his voice was as he said, "I think there must be at least one with us tonight who has decided the solemn question, the language of whose heart is, 'I have come over on the Lord's side.' May not our hearts be encouraged by the knowledge of it? Is there not some one who will, by rising, indicate to us that the decision is made? We will wait a moment." There was a little, almost breathless stillness, then Abbie touched my arm, drawing at the same moment a quick little breath of delight. I raised my head and caught one glance from Lycia Simon's earnest eyes as she resumed her seat. "What a Christian she will be!" I said to myself. I knew that she would be a determined, whole-hearted anything that she undertook. I did not seem to be much surprised. My own heart was so full of peace that the strangeness seemed to me that any one could hesitate. Then I heard Dr. Mulford say in tremulous undertone, "Thank God," and the occasion of it was that his only son, who was alternately his pride and his torture, who was the child of almost agonizing prayer, had determined the great question of his life. There were others. A new impetus seemed to have been given to the meeting. It seemed a little foretaste of the joy of heaven. In the hall we lingered. Dr. Mulford was talking with Mr. and Mrs. Tyndall, and Dr. Douglass hurried over to speak a word to young Mulford. Lycia Simon stood near me. I could not help saying a word to her, but I couldn't think of much to say. I held out my hand and said simply, "I am so glad." "You were the means of my coming to a decision at last," she said, as she gave my hand a hearty clasp. I felt my face flush with surprised delight as I said eagerly, "I was? How is that possible? What have I ever said or done that could have helped you?" "Nothing," answered straightforward Lycia. "At least nothing until tonight. I never quite believed in you before. But when you arose, I felt that there was a hidden power in it all that I didn't understand, and I wanted it." I could not answer her. My thankful tears kept me silent. God had chosen to use the very means that I had honestly feared would be a stain. Dr. Douglass and I walked home together, which was a rare thing, as he generally hastened away on professional work the moment the meetings closed. "It was a wonderful place tonight, was it not?" he said joyously as we left the church. "Wonderful," I repeated. "And, Dr. Douglass, I don't think you know how much that word means tonight." "Do I not?" he said smiling, and added, "I think I know more about it than you imagine, what it means to you. I have not watched your life, and prayed for you constantly during these months, without knowing more or less of your inner conflict, and watching with no little anxiety for the result." Then we had one of those old, pleasant talks together, such as we had not enjoyed in months. Just as we turned the corner of Grove Street, the doctor suddenly changed the subject. "By the way, Julia, what of our other friend," indicating by a backward motion of his head the persons behind us. "Has he any special interest, do you think?" "Who? Mr. Sayles, you mean? "Oh, no, not the slightest. I don't think he ever had a serious thought in connection with the subject." "Have you had some serious talks with him?" "Scarcely ever," I answered humbly, feeling then all the strangeness of my answer, when I remembered how constant my opportunities had been. "I have not done anything that I ought to have done, Dr. Douglass." "Come in, Jerome," Mrs. Tyndall said, when our party reached the door. "I don't know about it," he said in undertone to me. "I am afraid I shall be a foreign element." Nevertheless, he came in. We stopped in the hall to lay aside our things, Abbie and I, and Mrs. Tyndall came out to us just as we were ready to enter the parlor, meeting us in the doorway, with her husband and Mr. Sayles and Dr. Douglass for listeners. She turned to me with that winning air of hers, and touching her lips tenderly to mine, she said gently: "I have not helped you in any way, Julia. I fear in any respect my life has been such as to lead you astray. Shall we begin again and try to help each other?" I did not answer her in words. I could not. I felt happy and humbled. How I had been despising her in my heart during all these weeks, and yet in every respect she had proved the nobler woman of the two. I remember just how my mountain of sin towered high around me that night. Look where I would, I saw only follies and failures. "And yet you were happy?" And yet I was happy. In one sense, what mattered it? The sins were covered over with the hand of Christ. Very low, very unworthy, very shamefaced for the life I had led, for the ill I had done, and the good that I had not done, but, in spite of all that, forgiven. The element that was left out of my composition was moral courage. This is the sentence with which Mr. Sayles broke the silence that had hovered over us for a little. "Why, Jerome," Mrs. Tyndall responded, great surprise in her voice, "I have always thought you a remarkably courageous man." He smiled faintly, and then immediately growing grave again, said earnestly: "I presume every one of you think that I have no part nor lot in this matter; that I am perfectly indifferent. I am not certain that I have a part in it, but indifferent I certainly am not. I think I would have given $1,000 to have been able to have indicated tonight my desire for your prayers, but it seemed to me that leaden weights were attached to my feet. Julia, when you arose, I thought I certainly should, but you see I did not. I resolved, however, to speak to you here at home about my hopes, my fears, and resolves. His voice, that had trembled visibly as he spoke these sentences, now stopped entirely, and the composed, self-controlled man of the world bent forward, his elbow resting on the little table at his side, and shielded his face with his hand to hide the emotion he could not control. No one seemed able to speak. We were all surprised and thrilled. Dr. Douglass broke the silence, speaking in a voice that trembled: "We had thought our cup of thanksgiving was full tonight, but you have filled it to overflowing." He raised his head again, and smiled in answer to the doctor's words. "Thank you," he said. "I knew you would be glad. I thank you more than I can express for your faithfulness to me. This is not a suddenly formed purpose. I have been thinking of it for weeks. I have been almost decided a great many times, and have been held back with the thought of what my friend Tyndall here would think or say, and then the Lord took away that refuge and left me no excuse." He laid his hand on Mr. Tyndall's arm as he spoke, and that gentleman gave him a glad, bright smile. One could see that those two gentlemen were destined henceforth to be such friends as men rarely are. "Let us have a little prayer meeting," Dr. Douglass said, suddenly, speaking in tones that were throbbing with joy. "I am sure that we must all be in the spirit of prayer, and we have very much to be thankful for." So we knelt to pray. It was a thankful meeting, to none more so than to me. I remember I wondered if the joy of heaven was not increased to mother that night, because her wandering child had been called back to the fold. "The work has commenced anew," Dr. Douglass said, detaining us as we were about to separate for the night. "The spirit of the Master was never more manifest among us than it was tonight. It is a good time to commence the Christian life, or to gird up our hearts afresh. There is much work to do. I have been thinking what a help it will be to us to select, each, a subject of special prayer and special effort, concentrating our thoughts and our hopes on one soul. I have found it a very great help to me to do so. I think God blesses such special personal efforts. What do you all think? How is it, brother? Are you ready for work?" This seemed so strange a remark to address to Mr. Sayles. He felt its strangeness, and its pleasantness, apparently, for he answered, with a bright face: "Indeed, Doctor, I'm hardly prepared to pledge myself, for I feel that I do not know how to pray for myself; but I know a friend about whom I have already begun to feel anxious." "Pray for him, then," Dr. Douglass said, earnestly. "The Lord will show you how." We pledged ourselves, and the doctor added: "One thing more, let us not forget that the method which God has been pleased to give us by which to show our sincerity is to work for that which we are praying about. I find in my own heart a tendency to forget that part." My thoughts went swiftly and steadily toward one person. I don't know how I came to have such an intense desire for the conversion of Frank Hooper, but it seemed to burden me. I remembered with a strange feeling of surprise and shame that I had prayed for her heretofore in a very strange and spasmodic manner. Just before or after the times when I had tried to approach her personally on religious topics, I had been in the habit of remembering her in my prayers, and then, perhaps, for weeks I would not think of her again. It was as if I had determined that a prayer now and then was all I had time to bestow on her, and ought to be sufficient. I began to understand something of the folly of my attempts to do good, and to see how very far from real earnestness I must have appeared in the sight of God. I prayed for Frank that evening as I never had prayed for her, or indeed for anybody before. "Isn't it wonderful about Mr. Sayles?" I asked Abbie. "I was so amazed. I thought he was perfectly indifferent to the whole subject." Abbie's face had been radiant all the evening, and her voice matched her face as she answered: "It is blessed, and, yes, it is wonderful. But I do not think I am surprised. I was looking for it. God answers prayer, you know." "Had you been praying for him specially?" I asked her. "For weeks and weeks. He seemed to me in such great need, and so nearly ready." I was very much astonished. How different he must have seemed to her from what he did to me! And then I remembered that my life had not been such as to draw from him any secret interest on the subject that he might have felt, and hers had. Perhaps that made all the difference. I went early to the shop the next morning, very full of the subject that had engrossed my heart the night before, and very eager to find an opportunity to express my desire. I hoped by going early to meet Frank alone. She had of late been working over hours, both morning and evening, plunging into the work with a sort of desperation, it seemed to me, as if she would try to absorb her whole soul in the business before her, and leave neither time nor strength for anything else. As I had hoped, she was in her corner, driving her wheel around with nervous haste. No one else was in the room. I went over to her directly. I did not wait for the accustomed good morning, nor respond to her greeting, "How happens it that you are such an early bird?" but plunged at once into my subject. "Frank, I have something I want to say to you. I came early on purpose to see you alone. I think my way of talking to you about religion heretofore has been insufferable. I wonder that you endured it at all. I know my life has been such that if you judged from me, you must have thought there was nothing in religion but a name. But there is. Oh, Frank, don't think it is all delusion. Don't judge of Christians by me. I have been all wrong. So wrong that I wonder God let me live to do mischief. But I am going to try again. I want to live differently, and, Frank, I want you to love Jesus. I want that more than anything else on earth." I remember the words I spoke as well as though they had been yesterday. I was all in a tremble of eagerness. When I first began there had been a mocking smile on Frank's face, but it changed, and when I stopped she had checked her wheel and stood looking at me gravely and thoughtfully. Presently she drew from her pocket a dainty note, and said with eyes fixed searchingly on my face: "Did you know she wrote me this note?" "She? Who? No, I don't know anything about a note. What is it?" She passed it to me quietly. "Read it," she said, "and tell me if you know anything about it." Thus it read: "Dear Frank, I have ill-treated you. I want you to forgive me. I have been proud and weak and wicked. I have been blind, too, but God has opened my eyes. I cannot think how I could have lived as I did. Now I have begun to pray for you. I know your heart needs Jesus. Don't judge from my life that there is no such person, only try him. I shall pray for you every day, every hour, I think, so great is my desire to have you happy in Christ. I am sorry for the many ways in which I have hurt your feelings. I think you will forgive me, my Savior has. Yours truly and earnestly, Mrs. H. F. Tyndall." My look of utter astonishment during the reading of this letter, and when I handed it back, must have convinced Frank of my ignorance of its contents. "You knew nothing about it, then?" she asked. "Nothing at all. Isn't it utterly unlike Mrs. Tyndall?" "It isn't from any Mrs. Tyndall that I ever knew," she answered emphatically. "Then you and she have held no conversation about me?" with another very searching look into my eyes. "Not a syllable. I haven't mentioned your name to her, nor she yours to me, in weeks." Frank turned again to her wheel, and began to make it spin again. "After all," she said, with a mocking smile again gathering on her face, "I don't know but there is something in it. Do you suppose if I take it to myself, it will have such a transforming effect on me, as it seems suddenly to have had on Mrs. Tyndall and you?" I did not answer her. My eyes and my voice were full of tears. It seemed to me that I could not let this be the only result of our talk together. A moment after she spoke gravely. "Julia, I think a good many things that I do not speak. But I may as well tell you, that I respect your religion this morning, a thing I never did before. Perhaps I may do more than that. Time will tell." And then the girls came laughing and chattering in, and I had to go to my desk. Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 26, in which I feel my destiny approaching. Have you ever heard of Mr. Alec Tyndall, brother to our Mr. Tyndall? This was the question that Mr. Sayles asked me one evening as we were coming home from church. Abbie had been detained at home by a slight illness, and we were alone. "No, or yes," I answered. "I have heard of him. Mrs. Tyndall mentions his name occasionally." "You don't know, I presume, that he is coming home?" "I don't know where he is, nor where his home is." "And you are at this moment engaged in wondering why I think you should care to know anything about him," he answered, laughing. "But what if I tell you that his homecoming insures us a wedding in our circle?" "A wedding!" I repeated, in astonishment. "Yes, and a speedy one, I trust. The waiting has been long and weary enough." "I can't imagine what you are talking about. Where is this gentleman coming from, and where is he coming, and who is going to be married, and how did it all happen?" "What a rush of questions! Your indifference vanishes the moment a wedding is proposed. Well, this gentleman is coming from California, where he took refuge several years ago after the financial crash. He will be here in perhaps 2 weeks, possibly sooner, and, now I am going to astonish you, the lady involved in this matter is Frank Hooper." "Frank Hooper!" I ejaculated, in utter amazement. "How can that be possible? Why, when did it come to pass? Is she really engaged to him?" "She is, and has been for the last 4 years. There is quite a long story connected with it. Frank's father, you know, was a very wealthy man, but lost everything in the financial panic between 2 and 3 years ago, about 3 it is now. Alec was wealthy too, and met with the same fate. He was involved with his brother, and he would have crashed too, if it hadn't been for his wife. She is the wealthy one, you know. Alec lost everything, and there was no resort but to begin at the foot of the hill. He fled to California, where he has been ever since. He has been successful beyond his wildest hopes, and now I suppose he is speeding toward home and Frank." "But I don't understand," I said, in a greatly perplexed tone. "If they have been engaged all this time, how is it that people know nothing about it? Nobody does, do they?" "Not a soul save myself. That was a freak of theirs. Perhaps you don't need to be told that Mrs. Tyndall hasn't always been absolutely angelic in her dealings with people, and didn't love Frank very deeply. Alec knew her well, and had an immense respect for her and for her ability to do mischief. So he conceived the brilliant idea of keeping the entire matter a secret. It was a comparatively easy thing to do. You see, he did not live here. He was in business in New York, but he was also connected with his brother's firm, and that of itself brought him here frequently. And so by taking me into complete confidence, and letting me engineer the correspondence, we had it all arranged. A tedious time they have had of it, though. I am glad for them that the struggle is over." "But I thought that you—" This much I said, and then I stopped in confusion. He laughed pleasantly. "You thought what the rest of the world did, I presume, that I was being attentive to Frank on my own account, and then that I had deserted her on the eve of marriage, and still hovered around her much as a moth might be supposed to treat a candle, and no end of nonsense. Frank and I have had merry times over the whole story. Only, Julia, I did think you would hardly believe it of me, about the base desertion part at least. You know enough evil of me certainly, but I declare I did not think you would consider me quite so far down as that." "I only half believed it," I said eagerly. "Some of the time I did not believe it at all, only I thought there must be some sort of foundation for it, I had the story so very straight." "Yes, I know, or at least I suppose Dr. Douglass enlightened you. I know he has believed it religiously. It is a wonder that he has succeeded in treating me as well as he has." "Does he know about it now?" "Not he. He gives me courteous little hints every day about one of the duties of a new Christian life, to undo the mistakes that have been made, so far as it is in one's power, and I know he classes Frank among the mistakes." "Why don't you tell him?" "For two reasons. First, having kept Frank's secret so long, I don't propose to go around enlightening people. I mean to let circumstances do that. It will be vastly more interesting, I think, though I make an exception in your favor, you see. Secondly, I think Dr. Douglass, good, noble man though he is, needs a little bit of a lesson. He is almost as ready as commoner mortals are to deliberately swallow those prodigious lies that go floating around town about people. I'm using very strong language. I beg pardon. But the subject demands some indignation. I am not offended with the doctor. I used to be. I used to nearly detest him on this very account, and but for interposing circumstances I should almost have merited his contempt by doing the very thing, in a sense, that he believed of me, merely to prove to him that I did not do it. That's talking in riddles to you, isn't it? Never mind. I'm glad you are so pure and open-hearted. It is that, in a sense, which has saved me. Well, I am not at all out of sorts with the doctor now. I know him to be thoroughly pure gold, and he certainly had strong provocation for believing the stories about me. You see, Frank and Aleck were to have been married in about 6 weeks, when the crash came, and people knew that she was, and knowing nothing about Aleck, naturally supposed that I was. Only the question is, why should I have been pitched up as the perpetrator of a great meanness because she packed her marriage robes away in a trunk instead of wearing them, when I was with her just the same, not a break of 24 hours in our friendship? Wouldn't that have been a queer way to have managed the other matter? But people are not willing to give me the benefit of the doubt. They were more than ready to pitch into me if there was anything ugly that needed believing. Why, all right. However, the doctor wasn't here during the time that all this occurred, and is more excusable. At the same time, it won't hurt him to discover that he made a blunder. Don't imagine that I blame you, Julia, for crediting the story in a measure. It was the most natural thing imaginable under the circumstances." "I did not credit it," I said earnestly. "At least, I mean, I thought that it could be explained in a way that would not compromise you, and Mrs. Tyndall, you know, never thought any such thing." "No," he said, laughing. "She thought something worse. That is, she professed to think that it was a grand flirtation on my part, and a grand effort on Frank's part to secure a husband. But I always gave her the credit of thinking that she didn't believe any such thing. She thought I wanted Frank and couldn't get her. I know she did. It was a very reasonable thing to think. It must have looked like that to those who disbelieved the other 2 stories, and must have something to rest their hopes on. Besides, Mrs. Tyndall was exceedingly fearful lest that should be the state of things. She didn't like Frank, and she wanted to keep her down, out of her circle. You may imagine I enjoyed her state of mind, knowing all the time that Frank was destined to be her sister-in-law." "It is all very queer," I said, feeling very light-hearted that all things were just as they were. "When will they be married?" "Why, very soon, I should think, though I know but little about it. I haven't heard from Tyndall personally for months. I get hosts of envelopes addressed to me in his handwriting, but not a line does he vouchsafe to me beyond the bare announcement that he was to sail in such a steamer, and would telegraph me on his arrival in New York. I haven't heard from him directly since December. However, I suffered in a good cause. Frank has had longer letters in consequence, I presume." "Is this Mr. Tyndall a Christian man?" I asked, and Mr. Sayles' voice saddened at once. "Oh dear, no. He is very far removed from that. When I used to be constantly with him, he was nearly, if not quite, an infidel. I don't think he led me as far into the mist as he was himself, but far enough to cause me some miserable days and nights since, and I have no reason to hope that he has changed his views since that time." "Don't you dread his influence over Frank?" "Indeed I do. She is so new in the Christian life that she needs much help instead of such powerful hindrance. And I dread his influence over his brother very much, and, I might add, over myself. He is a very fascinating man, has almost a magnetic influence over people, and a very sarcastic man, ready and willing to turn anything into a kind of quiet, gentlemanly ridicule. I don't know how his brother is going to endure it. Aleck will be a member of his family, I presume, for a time. Very likely he will never be in or on hand at the hour of family prayers, but what he will say at the idea of a blessing being asked at his brother's table, or whether Tyndall will have the courage to attempt it or not, I don't know. I feel in a very good deal of trouble about it all." "Does Frank feel disturbed?" "I don't know. I haven't had the heart to ask her. She has had such a stormy life of late years, only so recently settled into calm, that I haven't felt equal to suggesting more breakers ahead, especially as the suggestion would do no sort of good. No, thank you, I cannot go in to night. I have a little business that must be attended to." "I am to keep this story quiet, I suppose?" "Yes, please. They will know in a day or two, if they do not already, that Aleck is coming. Frank says he wrote his brother by the same steamer that her last letters came, but his letter seems to have been delayed. About the rest of it he must tell his own stories, of course, and I wish him joy of the scene. Mrs. Tyndall is very much changed in many respects, but I fancy she will not like Frank Hooper for a sister. By the way, you can gossip over this matter with your cousin Abbie, if you choose. I mentioned it to her last evening, but did not tell her particulars. I will not keep you from her longer, for she said she had something special to talk with you about, and I shall have something special to say to you to-morrow evening. Can I see you?" "Yes," I answered, and then I went in with glowing cheeks and shining eyes. Just here I have paused, pen in hand, and thought whether or not, since this history of part of my life was destined to be used as a Sabbath school book, it would be well for me to write herein some of the thoughts that filled my heart that night, and some of the incidents that followed. It seems to be quite generally believed that a Sabbath school book should utterly ignore two great questions that have to do with human hearts, love and marriage. I never was able to understand why. Certainly, young misses of 16 think of these matters, and even those who attend Sabbath school and draw Sabbath school books think of them, I believe, a great deal more than is well for them. I am sure I did. Why should I then, in giving to these young ladies the story of a piece of my life, in the sincere hope that it may help them to avoid my blunders and causes of failure and unhappiness, why should I be very plain and frank as regards other subjects, and quite silent in this, merely in the fear that some critic will criticize my story for having broached in it the awful and forbidden subject? I will tell you my story truthfully, without the fear of a critic before my eyes. Plainly, then, I came into the hall in a great flutter. I felt sure that a crisis in my destiny was coming to me on swift wings. Tomorrow evening he would have something special to say to me. Didn't I feel in every throb of my heart what it would be? Didn't I know when he was taking such pains to explain to me that he had never been other than a friend to Frank Hooper, just what he meant me to understand? Life looked very rose-colored to me. I remember the feeling well. I went up with swift feet to Abbie. I was eager for sympathy. I pulled down my hair and began in a very nervous way to braid it, while, as Abbie questioned me about the meeting, I tried to determine in my own mind which I should do. Should I tell her first about that last sentence spoken in such a peculiarly meaning tone as he clasped my hand, or should I tell her all about Frank and the wedding in prospect, and the commotion that would probably be awakened in our household, waiting until the glaring gaslight was turned out, and only the soft, quiet moon gave us light, while I told her of the other, and the rush of sweet hopes and plans and possibilities that had been set to throbbing in my heart? I decided on the latter course. She was deeply interested in Frank, and questioned eagerly and earnestly, so that it was not until just after I had finished the last braid, and said, "Shan't I turn out the gas now, and won't we have a bit of quiet talk in the moonlight?" that she, assenting eagerly, and standing there, leaning her head against the window sash, and looking out into the glorious beauty of the night, said, "Did Mr. Sayles say anything of me?" "Yes," I answered promptly. "He said I might tell you all about this matter of Frank's, and "Oh, yes, he said you had something special to tell me about. What is it, Abbie?" She turned a little then, and let me see her face, sweet and pure and smiling, and she said, softly: "I have something very special. I wanted to tell you that last evening he asked me to be his wife." Chapter 27 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 27, in which I looked for one scene and saw another. Dear girls, you who are 16, almost 17, if ever you have been, or ever you should be, in just the position that I was that evening, standing there with my cousin Abbie in the moonlight, and listening to that softly whispered sentence, let me commend to you, at least in this particular, my conduct. I did not faint. I did not cry out. I did not push my cousin from me as I would a serpent, in heroic novel style. I stood very quietly, and received her sweet kiss at the end of the sentence, and returned it; and the thing of which I was dimly conscious was a sense of relief that I had not told her about that last sentence at once, but had waited until circumstances made it unnecessary ever to tell it. I do not remember how I congratulated her, or indeed whether I had brains enough to do it at all. I was very much amazed and a good deal stunned. Of course I had never dreamed of such a thing. I remember being very glad that the gas was turned out, and only the soft pale moon lighted the room. I know I carried a very heavy heart to bed that night, and I remember that after Abbie was quietly sleeping I shed some bitter tears, but at last I, too, fell asleep, and thus ends the record of the wonderful day in which I felt my destiny coming to me on such swift wings. "Have you learned anything about the special matter that I had to consult you about?" Mr. Sayles asked me, as he came forward on my entrance to the parlor the next evening, and held out both hands in greeting. "I think I have," I answered, promptly and gaily. "But, Mr. Sayles, doesn't the consultation come rather late?" He laughed merrily. "Oh, no, indeed. There are a great many things to settle yet, and an obdurate young woman to persuade into anything like reasonable behavior. Julia, were you surprised?" I suppose my cheeks glowed. I don't see how they could well help it. I know they felt very red; but the room was warm, and my cheeks are naturally rosy, so, after all, I am not certain that any one but myself knew about them. I know I answered steadily: "Yes, I was very much. I don't know when I have been more astonished." "Why, were you?" he said, looking amazed. "I didn't think you would be. I thought you would have seen through it long ago. I have given you credit for more clear-sightedness than you possess, haven't I?" He had indeed. "But," he continued eagerly, "this was not this special thing after all. I knew Abbie would tell you about it, but I was eager to claim my cousinship, and say to you how glad I am that—" And then followed the usual words on such occasions, very kind and very complimentary, about considering him in the light of a cousin not only, but a brother, he should be so glad to— I interrupted him saucily. "I had a brother of my very own," I told him. "The nicest brother in the world, and I shouldn't accept any platonic brotherhood." Then followed a great deal of pleasant nonsense, in which Abbie joined merrily, and it was interspersed with some earnest words; but I distinctly remember that the whole talk only served to make me feel sick and miserable, and more utterly desolate than I had felt in a long time. A few days thereafter, as we obeyed the summons to tea, I became conscious soon after I entered the dining room of a strange presence there, a tall, dark, singularly handsome man, and there immediately rushed over me a remembrance of what I had heard about the singular fascination that Mr. Aleck Tyndall's face possessed; so before Mrs. Tyndall had said, "My brother, Mr. Tyndall, Miss Ried," I knew that it was he. He talked exceedingly well, being one of those talkers whose words flow on smoothly and quietly, without apparently the slightest effort on their part, and without seeming to be aware that they are in the least degree remarkable. When we gathered around the table, there was one thing that surprised me. It was the instant quiet bending of his head and the shading of his eyes with his hand. This before there had been given him any indication that in his brother's family they had learned to recognize a heavenly Father's hand in supply of their daily needs. Mr. Sayles had misjudged our Mr. Tyndall's strength, or rather his weakness. His voice was never quieter nor firmer, than when he asked a simple blessing on the food. Meantime, I speculated over Mr. Alec Tyndall's conduct. Had he learned the new order of things, and was this his graceful concession to the ways of the household, or was it his habit, since there was a strange gentleman added to the family, to take all things for granted until proved to the contrary? I inclined to the latter opinion, as that would seem in keeping with his inimitable courtesy, and he did not by word or look express surprise at his brother's new position. During the remainder of the evening part of our household at least were on the qui vive. "I wouldn't be in his shoes," said Mr. Sayles, with an expressive shrug of his shoulders, "for an interest in his bank account." "Why?" I asked curiously. "What do you imagine Mrs. Tyndall will do or can do? She hasn't them in her power in any way." "Oh, no, but she has it in her power to make them an immense deal of botheration; and she'll exercise her power, too, or I'm mistaken; and I should hate it so. I do hate scenes and trouble of all sorts." I remember I wondered whether Abbie would not have been a little, just a little, better pleased with him if he had been a shade more self-sustained and manly. If she would, she didn't express it by look or act, but simply questioned in her quiet way, "Don't you imagine he is equal to the occasion?" And Mr. Sayles laughed, and gave her an admiring glance as if she had said a remarkable thing, and answered, "Upon my word, I think he is, if any mortal ever was." So on that conviction we rested, waiting for further developments. Matters were very quiet the next day. Mr. Tyndall was absent the most of the day, and Frank was not in the shop. We, Abbie and I, wondered if Mrs. Tyndall knew anything about it yet, and concluded that she did not; and we discovered nothing until the next morning. Mr. Sayles had come in to get Mr. Alec Tyndall to accompany him on a drive, and found us at breakfast. He drew up his chair, took a cup of coffee with us, and stopped to prayers. The doctor was present, and led the service that morning. As we were about to separate, Mrs. Tyndall said, in her simplest, most matter-of-course tone, "By the way, Jerome, you must come in to tea. We are going to have a quiet little family party at tea time, and a few friends in the evening. Alec is going to bring Frank down to tea. You don't mind these ladies knowing that Frank is one of the family, do you, Alec?" "Not in the least," Mr. Alec Tyndall said, with a gracious bow to the ladies; and Mr. Sayles ere he answered glanced over at me with such a curious look of delighted astonishment that I disgraced myself by laughing. I did not expect to meet Frank at the shop, but she was there, and had been apparently for some time, and was working very rapidly. She looked precisely the Frank that she had always been as regarded dress and manner, but there was a radiant look in her eyes that I could account for, though I knew the others could not. In the course of the morning I stood near her. She and I had grown very near to each other in heart during the last few weeks, yet I did not like to speak first of her personal affairs, though I felt very curious, and also somewhat anxious to have her understand that I knew of the arrangements. She broke the silence, however. "You belong to that family party this afternoon, of course?" she said, in a low tone, with a vivid blush and a bright smile. "Yes, I do," I answered eagerly. "Oh, Frank, why didn't you tell me about it?" "I told nobody," she answered decidedly. "He had been gone a long, long time, and California is very far away, and the world is full of changes. But," with that brilliant smile of hers, "it doesn't matter who knows it now." We were hurried in the shop. There was little time for talk. Mr. Jerome Sayles had managed the matter of the afternoon holiday for Frank and myself. The other girls could not imagine with what argument, but of course I surmised. At noon Frank piled up her boxes snugly in a corner. "There," she said. "Ruthie, don't let any one touch my work. I mean to be here bright and early to-morrow morning to finish it. Are you ready, Julia?" And with a parting bow and smile to the girls, and a gleeful reply that she was going to seek her fortune in answer to their curious questions as to what was going to become of her that afternoon, we left the shop together. "They are good girls, every one of them," she said earnestly, as we went down the familiar street. "I shall never forget how good and kind they have been to me. When I have a house of my own, the first thing I shall do will be to invite them all to spend the day with me. I should have liked Mrs. Tyndall better if she had asked every one of them to meet me to-night; but that would have been too much to expect of flesh and blood." "And after all," I said somewhat hesitatingly, "they are not quite your company. I mean you cannot enjoy their society exactly." "No," she answered promptly. "We are not congenial, perhaps. That is, I have received a good education, and enjoy it, and they have not, and don't care for it. But they are nice, good girls, for all that; and I enjoy their society quite as well as I do Mrs. Shoddy's, for instance, who lives in a palace on Regent Street, and uses worse grammar than any of them do. You understand that I think it is not because I work in a shop that I am not fitted to shine in any circle, nor does my working there make me fit. That is merely an accident, force of circumstances, or choice of work, and has nothing whatever to do with position. That's my platform." And then we parted, to meet again 3 hours later in Mrs. Tyndall's elegant parlors. Abbie and I were in the room, so also was Mr. Sayles, or Jerome, as we all called him now, when Mr. Aleck Tyndall and Miss Hooper arrived. I think I have spoken before of Frank's severe plainness of dress; she had never varied it in the least. I had never seen her in other than the simplest of material and make, and with her hair stretched plainly back in a net. As she came forward now I could not restrain a start of astonishment, and I saw Jerome's eyes dance. She evidently looked natural to him. She wore a soft, silky, sheeny dress of silvery hue, entirely new, exquisitely made as to trimmings and fit, and it became her as nothing ever had before, and her hair fell loose about her neck in round, puffy, natural curls. It seemed to me that Mrs. Tyndall must have thought the two singularly well mated. She advanced to meet them, held out her hand to Frank as simply and cordially as though she had entertained her but yesterday, kissed her in a familiar sisterly way, and said: "You're tired, aren't you, with your long walk? Aleck, you wretch, why didn't you take the carriage? That is a pretty way to take care of her. You think because you are a Hercules in that matter that everyone is. He'll walk you to death, Frank. Take this chair, you get a pleasanter view than in the one you have chosen." And this was the famous meeting, the wonderful scene, that we had planned about, and gossiped over, and been nervous in view of for days. "Ahem!" said Jerome, by way of attracting my attention. But I persistently talked to Frank, and wouldn't look. I knew I should laugh if I did; and he finally contented himself with a walk to the back parlor, where he leaned over the piano and whistled Yankee Doodle in a very undertone. We had an early, quiet tea, but with one surprise. As we settled into that hush which precedes the lifting up of thankful hearts, Mr. Tyndall said in a voice in which there was a great throb of joy: "Aleck, will you ask a blessing?" And the infidel bowed his head, and the strange voice uttered a few reverent, grateful words. Frank's face expressed joy, but not surprise; she had been told of the wonderful change; but Mr. Sayles' face expressed unbounded astonishment. He walked with me back to the parlor; he had lost all desire to laugh; his tone was earnest and solemn. "The Lord can take care of his own, it seems, without your and my fretting about it," he said, emphatically. "But I declare to you I never was more amazed in my life. I could as soon have expected that bit of marble to ask a blessing. But then, when one thinks of it, he might well have been equally surprised at hearing me. The way in which we have all been led is wonderful, perfectly wonderful. How could any one know of the facts concerning just this small company without recognizing at once a power above and beyond all human strength?" We had a wonderfully pleasant evening. We had a very choice selection of guests, prominent among whom were Lycia Simons and Florence Hervey. Dr. and Mrs. Mulford were the latest to arrive. I had to spend nearly half my time in watching Frank. She glided into this new position, or rather back into her old position, so smoothly and gracefully, and there was about her a certain quiet dignity, a half nameless deference to those around her, that was new and exceedingly becoming. "What are they going to do?" I asked Mr. Sayles in the course of the evening. "I don't know, I'm sure. Tyndall wants to be married at once, I knew he would; and Frank won't, I knew she wouldn't. Women are so confoundedly silly and obstinate, begging your pardon, of course. But they must spend 10,000 years in sewing if anybody is waiting to marry them. They have both wills made of iron. I suppose they will fight it out until one of them yields." Later in the evening we grew merrier, and some wise brain proposed impromptu charades and tableaux, a suggestion which Mrs. Tyndall caught at eagerly, and Mr. Sayles and I entered into very heartily. We really had some very good ones; I remember them distinctly. Presently Mr. Sayles came over to me with a puzzled look. "They are going to have a marriage scene, and Aleck and Frank are to be the actors. It isn't in the least like either of them. I wonder that they will enter into it." "Whose getting up is it?" I asked. "Mrs. Tyndall's. She seems to be in high glee over that and everything else. What a woman she is!" "Who will they get to officiate?" "Don't know. It's a wonder they didn't ask me. I expected it. I always used to be selected for matters of that sort. I wouldn't do it, though. I don't like farces of that kind. The thing has grown too sacred." And he glanced toward Abbie. "Hark!" as the folding doors began to slide. "They are coming. Who will they have for a clergyman? I'll be hanged if it isn't Dr. Mulford himself!" And then the hum of voices instantly hushed, for Dr. Mulford commenced the marriage service, the veritable words, without change or omission, pronounced in solemn tone even to the words, "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder," and then the prayer. And then we stood petrified, until Mr. and Mrs. Tyndall pressed forward, smiling and composed, to greet the bride. It was a bride, then? Yes, indeed, no farce about it. One of the iron wills had broken. Strong as words of man and words of prayer could make it, had the service been, and Frank Hooper was Mrs. Aleck Tyndall. I can't describe the commotion that followed. Everybody talked and wondered, and oh'd, and why'd, and laughed, and ate cake, and congratulated the bride, only Mr. Sayles. "It was rather cruel, Frank," he said, when opportunity offered, "to desert and take me so overwhelmingly by surprise at the last moment, when I have been your faithful ally for so long." "I hadn't an idea of it," she explained, eagerly. "I mean I hadn't the least intention of doing anything so wild. It seemed perfectly absurd." "How do you happen to be a married woman, then?" "I'm sure I don't know," she answered, meekly, and her husband smiled and said, he did, and it was perfectly satisfactory, and led her away. "It wasn't a very iron will, after all," I said to Jerome. "Yes, it was," he answered, emphatically. "Only he has got all of hers and all his mixed up together, somehow." "It was nice," announced this same gentleman, as every guest having departed, Mrs. Tyndall and I lingered a moment in the back parlor to talk over the strange circumstances with Abbie and Jerome. "It was nice. I liked it. No fuss or getting ready a century beforehand, no gossiping as to when it will be. I wish—" He stopped abruptly and seemed confused. Mrs. Tyndall laughed mischievously. "We'll go, Julia," she said, gaily. "We are unmistakably too large an audience for the discussion of that subject." Shall I confess what I did? I went to my room, and to bed, and when safe there in the darkness, I cried a little. I wasn't exactly unhappy, only miserably lonely, and also somewhat sentimental. But finally I dried my eyes and went to sleep. End of chapter 27. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 28 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 28, in which he led us in paths that we did not know. Oh, I think I was a Christian, a miserable, sick, weak one, not worth the name, yet I know I did have a feeling of trust in my Saviour, something that I would not have yielded for anything that I had in the world. This was what Mrs. Tyndall said in answer to a remark made by Dr. Douglass, as we all sat together one evening about 2 weeks after Frank's marriage. We had been taking a drive together in the large carriage, Abbie and Mr. Sayles, Dr. Douglass, Mr. and Mrs. Tyndall, and myself, and now Mrs. Tyndall was going farther in the little carriage with her husband, and while she waited for him she talked with Dr. Mulford, who had come in to see Dr. Douglass. "But," continued Mrs. Tyndall, "it was, after all, very unlike the feeling that I have now. I mean to live such a different life. You can't think how many things there are for me to undo. I am so thankful that I have health and leisure, so few people have both. There is no reason why I should not employ all my time in going about at work. I think there is a great deal to do." "There is indeed," Dr. Mulford answered, earnestly. "People with health and leisure and consecration are very rare, and very greatly needed. Why, Mrs. Tyndall, if you will put yourself subject to my disposal, I can keep you very busy every moment of the time." "I will," she said, eagerly. "That is just what I want, someone to direct my energy, for I really have a great deal. It has to be used in some way, but I don't trust my own way of doing things as much as I did." "Will you tell us," questioned Dr. Douglass, "what was the secret power that wrought upon you this change of which you speak, made you look at the Christian life and Christian work in such a different light?" Mrs. Tyndall turned suddenly toward my cousin Abbie, and gave her a look of loving gratitude, as she said, "It was watching another life, so totally different from my own, and yet professing to be governed by the same springs of action. I have noticed it, and watched her, and wondered over her manner of living from my first acquaintance." "A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump," Dr. Mulford quoted, musingly, as if thinking aloud. Then he laid his hand on Abbie's shoulder, and said tenderly, "God has greatly honored you, my child." "I?" said bewildered and wondering Abbie. "Why, I haven't done anything." "Only just lived," Dr. Douglass said, significantly, and Dr. Mulford added, "It is a great thing for a Christian to live." At this point Mrs. Tyndall left us, looking back to say, brightly, "Remember, Dr. Mulford, I am ready for work, and bubbling over with life and energy. I do hope you can give me a right channel to work in at last." We looked after them as they rode away, remarking upon how bright and graceful, and full of healthful life she was. "Can the Ethiopian change his skin?" Mr. Sayles said, gravely. "It seems he can. Who ever saw a more remarkable change than there is in that woman?" "She always had energy, plenty of it," Dr. Douglass said. "It is as she said, she was unceasingly at work. The trouble is that Satan pushed himself in as her chief aid sometimes. She was born to be a leader, though, I think. Dr. Mulford, I fancy you will find her very useful." "I expect to," the doctor said, heartily. "I can give her legitimate channels in which to work off her energy. I am glad she is just the woman she is, well and strong, and wealthy and willing." It wasn't 10 minutes after that, no, it could hardly have been 5, when a furious ring at the doorbell startled us all. "That must be a summons for you, Doctor," said Mr. Sayles. "No one else would be wanted in such desperate haste." And then, listening, we heard the quick, panting voice, "I want Dr. Douglass. Is he here?" "Yes," answered the doctor, going quickly forward. "What is wanted, my boy?" "They want you right away, down to the corner, sir. There's been an accident. Mr. Tyndall's horse got frightened at the band, and Mrs. Tyndall she's thrown and hurt bad. Some thinks she is dead." Before this sentence was concluded, Dr. Douglass had brushed past him, and was halfway to the corner. Consternation prevailed in the house. Abbie still had her wits, and rang bells, and gave orders for Mrs. Tyndall's bed to be thrown open, and hot water to be in readiness, and attended to half a dozen other thoughtful and wise arrangements, while Mr. Sayles and I still stood gazing solemnly at each other, and saying, "How very strange! How could it have happened? I thought that horse wasn't afraid of the band. Do you suppose she is much hurt?" and several other of those witless and unanswerable remarks that useless people make to themselves and each other at such times. Dr. Mulford had at once followed Dr. Douglass. Directly there came a trampling of feet and subdued voices. Then Dr. Douglass's voice issuing orders right and left. "Stand aside there. Sayles, come and help me here." "No," in answer to my terrified look. "She has only fainted. We decided to bring her home while she was unconscious." Abbie followed them up the stairs. I stayed below, looking after the curious or sympathetic people who immediately began to come on voyages of discovery or with offers of assistance. Mr. Sayles came down presently. "She will do everything," he said, speaking of Abbie, with a curious mixture of pride and annoyance. "She is hurrying around there as if she had the strength of a Samson." "Is she much hurt?" I asked, my thoughts still on Mrs. Tyndall. "No, I guess not. She has revived now, and spoken to Abbie. Douglass has sent for Dr. Vincent to consult, but that is more for the sake of pacifying Tyndall, I guess, than because he needs him." But 2 hours passed before we knew more. Dr. Vincent came and went up to the room, and Dr. Mulford came down and went out. Then presently Mr. Sayles was called for to go to Dr. Vincent's office for a certain case. I meantime was kept very busy below. People seemed determined to wring from me information that I did not possess, and the servants hung around with scared faces. At last Dr. Vincent went away. Dr. Douglass came downstairs with him, and they stood in the hall talking in low tones. I waited until the door closed on Dr. Vincent, then I went out. Dr. Douglass turned to me with a sad smile. "Poor child," he said, "how white it is! Are you very much frightened? How we planned, Julia. Here we were talking about her energy, and health and strength, and what a work she would do, arranging to give her enough employment for her eager, healthy life, and here, all the time, God had other plans that ran right athwart ours. "Is she going to die?" I asked, in an awed and frightened whisper. "No, not that," he said sadly. "She may live as long, longer than you or I; but she will never lift herself from that bed again." "Are you sure?" I asked him, immeasurably more shocked than I would have been had he told me that God was going to take her right away to himself. "Most hopelessly sure," he answered. "Both hip and spine are injured." He had to go back upstairs. I sat down on the lowest step of the long flight of winding stairs, and tried in a stunned way to take in the meaning of his words. Never lift herself from that bed again! Then she would never walk again. Was it possible that her graceful form would never flit down those stairs again? I looked around the large elegant hall, arranged with exquisite taste, and as well furnished as many parlors. Every article in sight and in memory bore the marks of her graceful, skillful fingers. Only a little while ago, she had set that vase of lilies under the glass, and had arranged their delicate cups, stopping to do it ere she tied the ribbon of her hat, the hat that lay now all battered and mud-stained under the table. I went forward and picked it up, and tried to bend the torn, limp thing into something like its former grace and beauty. It was of no use, it would never be fit to wear again, and its wearer would never need it any more. And I sat down with the bright ribboned, pitiful-looking hat, and shed bitter tears. Mr. Sayles, talking with me about it all, the next day, standing before me with folded arms and sad face, said, "It's hard, Julia, very hard, and the reason of it past finding out. I thought it would be so different. I wanted it to be. I wanted her to be able, as she said, to undo much of her work. I wanted people to see and realize as we do how changed she is. I wanted her to grow into having the influence over people religiously that she has had over them morally and fashionably all her life. And now here she lies, a living, suffering death. It is a hard death, too. No sympathy. People are shocked and sorry, but no one has any tears to shed. They can go right on without her. There is no one to cry out in bitterness of soul, 'I cannot get along without her help.' Oh my! I don't want to die like that. I feel it, you see. That is what my dying now would be. No one to care for me, no one to miss me because my life had led them nearer to Christ. But I won't die so. If God will give me a little more time, I will work for Him." Dr. Mulford had come quietly into the room, and as Mr. Sayles finished his excited sentence, the doctor laid a quiet hand on his shoulder, and said low and gently, "His ways are not our ways." That was all said and done and lived more than 3 years ago. I am 20 now. It is 4 years ago today that I first came to Newton. I came back to the place today after a long absence. It was but a little while after Mrs. Tyndall's accident that I went with Abbie to her home to help her make preparations for the wedding. I remembered at the time that my sister Esther went there once for the same purpose. We talked about that time a little while we made preparations. They were married at church one morning, and went away together, Mr. Sayles and she. They seemed very happy. I did not go back to Newton. I was tired in body and brain; also I was less wise and self-reliant than when I first went there, and so I yielded to Sadie and Dr. Van Anden's often repeated urgings, and went to New Haven to live. I have heard often from Newton during these intervening years, and have constantly meant to visit my friends here, but other plans and cares and duties have intervened. It was finally a telegram that brought me. It read thus: "Mrs. Tyndall died last night. Funeral on Thursday. Will meet the 10:50 train. Douglas." So at once I started, and today I reached here. Just 4 years ago today I came here a stranger, and she gave me kindly greeting. Today they led me to look at her white coffined face. My heart was very sad, and yet when I had taken one long look at the familiar face, lying there so white and still, I turned to Dr. Douglas and smiled. He seemed to understand my meaning. "Isn't the seal of the Spirit there?" he said. "It is as if one had a glimpse of heaven where she has entered in." Mrs. Aleck Tyndall was there beside us. She had been the real mistress of that home during these 3 years, for the nominal one never left the room where they had carried her that night, until they brought her down today in her coffin. Frank bent over the coffin with fast-dropping tears. "Yes," she said, "she has entered in. But oh, doctor, how can we live without her?" "Does she look natural, Julia?" Mr. Sayles asked me, and I answered quickly, "No, not at all. She looks angelic." "Oh, Julia!" A murmur of voices greeted me. "She looks what she has lived," said Mr. Sayles, tremulously. "If ever an angelic spirit lived in a house of clay, we have had one here with us for more than 2 years." "Perfect through suffering," Dr. Douglass said, softly. "Did she suffer very much?" I asked him. He bowed his head. "Fearfully, and with more than human patience." Dr. Mulford came in, greeted me silently, then went and looked long and earnestly at the face in the coffin. "It is gain to her," he said at last, "but what a fearful loss to us. The whole church is shaken." "It may well be," Mr. Sayles said. "What other 10 members of our church can begin to do her work?" I had heard much of this in letters, but I had not come to realize so as to forget the contrast. Those who had been with her constantly seemed to have forgotten all about any other life that she had lived than that of these last years. I did not refer to the old life, only I said to Mr. Sayles when we were alone together for a moment: "Don't you remember how, past finding out, the reason of this living death was to you the day after the accident?" And he, smiling sadly, answered: "And don't you remember Dr. Mulford quoted to us, 'God's ways are not as our ways.' Truly they are not, Julia. It has been the most wonderful life. There is not a scholar in our Sunday school, not a child in our streets, but she has managed somehow to reach." Mr. Sayles is very much changed, very much improved. He is more decided and earnest. But looking at him I realized more fully than I had before how we had probably all changed. I had, certainly. I scanned him with a sort of puzzled wonder, and tried to decide how it was possible that I could once have fancied that I cared for him. Could I be the same person who had so tremblingly awaited my destiny on the night which it was expected and did not come? Suppose it had. Suppose I had, but I actually turned away from him with a little shiver. He was nice, I realized that, and he was good. I liked him, I thoroughly respected him. But as for anything more than that! Oh, girls, dear girls, we do not see at 20 as we did at 16. An hour ago I stood at the coffin's head, looking down on that spiritual face. Dr. Douglass had come in with me, and had been telling much about the beauty of her life and the blessedness of her death. At last he said: "Once you thought she led you astray. Doubtless she did. It was one of her sorrows, but I comforted her. I told her I thought you had learned to listen first and always to the great Leader's voice, and be led first by him. Is it not so?" I answered humbly but decidedly: "I believe I have." We were silent for a little, and then he said: "Julia, cannot we who have adopted the same Leader, and are journeying toward the same home, walk together and help each other?" The sweet and solemn moonlight stole across the sweet dead face, and seemed to make it smile upon us; and I, with one hand resting on that coffin, and the other laid in his, felt that my joy had come to me at an hour when I sought it not. And together we will listen henceforth to the voice of our great Captain, and humbly follow where he leads. End of Chapter 28. End of Julia Ried by Pansy. Recording by Trisha G.